Hi, this is Jeff Nyquist, and I'm back here, Friends and Enemies with Alex Benesch. We're going to be talking about the intelligence use of UFOs, the occult, the paranormal. Alex, how are you doing today?
Oh, I'm good. I'm good. I just was finishing my report on General Albert Stubblebine, and I didn't get to finish this book you recommended to me. I'm reading it. Reading it right now. I couldn't finish it. It's Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, which ties into exactly what I've been doing with the whole Stubblebine report. For those who don't know, General Albert Stubblebine, he died a few years ago. He was a military intelligence Hall of Famer. Spent his whole career fighting communism. He didn't just follow the playbook. In Vietnam, he rewrote some of the playbooks. He developed some of his own playbooks. He was always about something new, progress and just moving things forward. They did a new order of battle, I think. At some point in his career, he was developing new ideas for the war of the future. So he was just all around very, very patriotic. His father was in the military. He's grown up in the military. And but now he's remembered for some of his, out there crazy work, experiments about remote viewing and, just using mind force to apply to certain for certain tasks. And they also thought they could create the warrior monk, create some sort of a Jedi type, Star Wars Jedi type soldier who could not just fight well, but also come up with new ideas to win battles and that sort of thing. And I did get to meet him, in 2009. He was over here in Europe with his wife, and because my wife knows Latin America, we actually went to Panama. We did a little round trip there. We went to Panama and we visited them in Panama where they worked, and so we did get to spend quite some time with. We called him Bird. It's just we called him Bird, and we just. I talked to him quite a bit, and now I just try to reconstruct his career going from this ultra patriotic, anti-communist warrior, becoming sort of an esoteric, and just he was also interested in UFO phenomena and every type of esoteric supernatural phenomena you could think of. How did it come to this? How did the old Bird turn into this new Bird? And so I did reconstruct quite a few stages of his career, and it you can find some groups and circles that also pop up in connection with the UFO alien thing.
Was Stubblebine religious, to your knowledge?
Um, well, not well. I didn't see any. I didn't see any religious activity from him. I didn't see any. I didn't see any prayer. I didn't see any symbols hanging around. I didn't notice anything really.
Hmm.
So it's
And he was an armor officer, as I recall from your presentation.
well, he
Um,
started in armor and then he
Started, yeah,
transferred.
and he went into intelligence, which he didn't want to go into initially. What's interesting is this discussion, the interest in the parapsychology on the part of scientists in the military. It was discovered long ago that the Russians were engaged in paranormal research, and this goes back to the Stalin era. But we really didn't get, as far as I know, more interested in it until around the 1960s. And there you'll find, if you look at declassified Air Force files, you'll find all these Air Force files about remote viewing tests. It was in the 60s that the Russians beat the record for someone remote viewing a deck of cards and getting an extraordinarily high score, the highest score that the Americans were aware that anyone in one of these tests had gotten before. You had the defector, Nikolai Koklov, who was like Alexander Litvinenko poisoned. I believe he was given radioactive thallium, but he survived. He lost all his hair, but he survived. Koklov told a friend of mine, I had a mutual friend with him, that he, in the sub basements of the Lubyanka in the 1950s, they were doing experiments, parapsychological experiments, with contacting entities that was terrifying. And so the Russians believed there was power in this. So of course, the Soviet Union is Marxism-Leninism is an atheistic philosophy, but that does not rule out, like Buddhism is an atheistic religion, it doesn't rule out belief that are other levels, other dimensions of existence from which power can be drawn. And this apparently I have a book on China's search for psychics. A lot of people don't know, but in the Soviet Union, they passed laws. And this is like something out of a science fiction book, but they passed laws and they encourage people, if your child shows psychic ability, we, the state, want to know. Did
But
you
they're
know that?
hiring or
Yeah.
delegating.
If your child, look for your child having these abilities. If they do,
Hmm.
go see your local office, whatever. And they wanted to recruit psychics. And there is Annie Jacobson, who wrote a book called Phenomena, and she's a very good journalist. Um, it is it's a scary book. A lot of it's about Uri Geller, who she meets and interviews, and Netanyahu is a friend of his, and trying to figure out
Oh, and by the
Netanyahu's
way,
use of intelligence.
just so people
Yeah.
realize, Yuri Geller was part of the reason the United States Department of Defense actually spent money on experiments. So,
Yes, and my experience is that when I was at UC Irvine, and of course some very interesting people are coming out of the UC Irvine psychology department. I was a political science major and graduate student, but I hung out in the psychology department, and my friends were in the psychology department. And they had a young parapsychologist back then in the 80s. His name was Mark Schaefer. He designed the tests on Uri Geller that I think it was what they did at Stanford. And and of course, I I got to, one of the things in social science is you look at experiment methods. I befriended, there was a scientist there named William Batchelder who was involved in math modeling brain functions, math modeling, things that the mind did. I took his course and it was brilliant. And I attended a seminar of his, a graduate seminar. And these people, the math they use, the sophistication of their experimental designs. And so Mark was a guy who designed experiments, and they asked him to design the Geller experiments. And he told me, I said, well, I heard that Geller cheated, right,
hmm.
on these tests. And he said, well, that's a misunderstanding. I had this agreement with Geller. Geller had these abilities, but Geller tried to make a living from them. And so, but his abilities didn't work when he wanted them. So he had to learn supplement tricks because he had to try to please an audience. So he urged Geller to try to cheat,
Hmm.
make sure that his experiments were properly designed. And this was kind of the scientist trying to get the subject of the experiment to keep him honest. And so, but he was curious. He saw things in the lab that he couldn't explain. So Geller made the claim that he could fix and break mechanical objects with his mind. So uh, Mark had an old pocket watch of his grandfather. I have one upstairs that was my great grandfather's. Same kind of deal. And it's the kind that in the three-piece suit, they have a little pocket for a watch and they'd have a chain and so on. Anyway, it wasn't working. He'd inherited it. He opened it up. The mainspring was in two pieces. It was broken. So he closed it back up and he brought it into Geller one morning and handed it to him and said, Yuri, can you fix this? Yuri held it, handed it back to him, and it was running. And Mark was like, I had to run back to my office. He had the tools there. He could open up. The mainspring was in one piece. And of course, Mark was not a parapsychologist at that point, but that's what decided him to go into that. Of course, he because of the tricks that were played on him by one of these stage magicians, he got out of it because he was hoaxed. And he got it. It's too problematic. But anyway, so the phenomenon, he's telling me is real. And in people I've talked to, talking about UFOs and talking about the paranormal, it is real. Whatever anyone says, there's phenomena they can't explain. There's things about reality. There's a man from UC Irvine psychology department. I don't believe I ever met him, but his name is Donald Hoffman. And not sure if I ever met him years ago. I don't remember him. How long he's been at UC Irvine, I'm not sure. But he wrote a book called The Case Against Reality, which has recently come out. And he talks about physics and psychology. And of course, I don't agree with all of his methods, but he's using some interesting psychological or social science methods. And what he's discovered is that that physical reality is secondary. It's produced by something else, and that the primary reality is behind it. Now, this is not a new idea. This is in Aristotle's Metaphysics. This is in Plato's Allegory of the Cave. This is in Schopenhauer. It's in Bishop Berkeley, right? If a tree falls in the forest and there's no one there to hear it, is there noise? Well, Hoffman says there isn't. In fact, when and I didn't know this, but did you know Einstein was troubled? Einstein was troubled by the idea that if nobody was looking at the moon, it wasn't there. And he was working on this problem. Did you know that? I didn't know that.
No, I don't remember
in
anything
Hoffman's
like this.
book, he discusses it. He talks about how Einstein attempted to satisfy himself that the moon really was there when no one was looking at it. But what a lot of these tests in physics are suggesting, and the Nobel Prize was given last year to three physicists three or four physicists who basically proved that physical reality that we're in is not primary. It is not real in the way we think of it, which is rather striking and shocking. And, Hoffman says, the idea of time-space is on its way out.
Yeah, it gets if people read some of the what the scientists are saying about multiple dimensions, it gets really, really complicated and really, really interesting. Yeah. And so always throughout recorded human history, people were developing science, but they were also you had the mystery cults in the ancient world, and there was no clear separation between anything really. And so then when the modern modern age of science came with the very influential organization called the Royal Society. This was a British organization. And so the Royal Society initially, they had, leading scientists, but it was also very, very, very esoteric. And some of the stuff that you read now seems kind of silly they were into, but they were still the leading scientific organization. And then
and this shows that physics always has had this spooky side. In fact, Sir Isaac Newton was very much involved in occult studies, wasn't he?
You had guys like John Dee, you had, I think Nikola Tesla was in a group called, the Ghost Club or something? It was just, they were all interested in not just science, but also things that, may beyond that. And so then when the Royal Society was reorganized and restarted under the new kings in Britain, sort of the esoteric stuff was dialed back. It was supposed to be the leading scientific body in the world. But all this out there stuff was still there in the background. And the sister organization of the Royal Society, the leading scientific body, sister organization was British Freemasonry, which ties back to the ancient world and the ancient empires and their mystery cults. So you see kind of the traces that are still there. And recently, mainstream newspapers in the United States, they ran these articles about today's technological leaders, from Elon Musk to others, the Silicon Valley guys, and how they, according to sources, how they are somewhat into esoteric stuff, and they also, some of them are reported to consume low doses of psychedelic drugs. So they're interested in that. And so again, this ties back to the old days of the Royal Society in the ancient world. You see scientists, and some of them, they do psychedelics to get new ideas. And this is sort of the blend that you get. And so some people they make fun of somebody like Bird Stubblebine, or they make fun of some other people like that, but they don't see the whole picture. They don't see how this has always been, attached to the science and the leading science. And if you look at somebody
and it's connected to politics, and it's connected to religion and theology, and it's connected to philosophy and military intelligence.
Yeah, and if you look at somebody like General Albert Newton Stubblebine III, we called him Bird, and if you look at somebody like Bird, in his career, he always wanted to, figure out new things, create a new order of battle for a major war against communism, create new playbooks, create new this, new that. He was always on the cutting edge, and so I'm not surprised that he got himself into some really out there experiments, because he did want to find something new. But of course, as in all of modern history, science was sort of the playground for spies. Obviously, this goes with the Royal Society and their activities, and of course all the other countries that were heavily into science. There were a lot of spooks, and so this became sort of an interesting backstory with Bird Stubblebine and the circles he was moving in, and so I had the impression that reviewing this his career and his shift from being this down to earth military intelligence guy, shifting to becoming what people now think of him as, this, kooky guy, this weird guy this crazy guy from the Cold War. How did this shift happen? And I think he was fairly burnt out and depressed after Vietnam, because we know how the Vietnam War went, and throughout the Cold War, some of these major intelligence failures were because of the moles, the traitors, like Kim Philby, Aldrich Ames, Robert Hansen. So they ruined a lot of operations. But a general at some point like Bird, he didn't know, especially in Vietnam in his earlier career, he didn't know about the moles. So imagine that you are responsible for operations, you're responsible for the soldiers, and operations fail. You see these young kids getting killed in the war, and he must have felt responsible. He must have felt frustrated, somewhat responsible, guilty. He was burnt out because he was such a work maniac. He was working so hard, and I think that after Vietnam, he was looking for something new. He had this desire, this urge for something new and spiritual. And I think this is how he got recruited into a circle I wasn't even aware of. This was a very powerful, tied to a very powerful institute. And probably nobody listening to us right now nobody has ever heard of this, because it's forgotten now. But it was called the Esalen Institute, and they were involved in some, just pure esoteric stuff, but they were also attached to famous writers like Aldous Huxley, famous psychiatrists. They were also attached to researchers using psychedelics to treat veterans, people with depression, people with post-traumatic stress. Now, this sounds a bit like Bird. He was probably pretty burned out after Vietnam, and it's somewhat likely that he had some experiences with psychedelics. And of course, nowadays you see both parties in America, the Democrats and the Republicans, they want to greenlight a decriminalization of psychedelics, and they also want to have many new therapeutic techniques involving psychedelics. So this was research back then, which is in many ways validated now. But back then, of course, it was more experimental and wild, and so this was sort of this vortex that Bird Stubblebine was getting into. He wanted to find new things, but not just for warfare. He also wanted to find a new spiritual outlet of some sort. And it seems like this network and this very interesting Salin Institute, it seems like there was some serious espionage going on in both directions. And especially in 1979, the Salin Institute began the Soviet-American exchange program. And in 1988, Salin brought one of Gorbachev's chief economic advisors to the United States. In 1989, Salin brought Boris Yeltsin on his first trip to the United States. And the Salin Institute arranged meetings for Yeltsin with the then President George H.W. Bush, as well as many other leaders in business and government. So this was kind of like, a playground for spooks, and also it seems like some of these ideas that were being pushed, to merge the East and the West and to have this world peace and all that. I think this was also, strategic on some level, because especially the Russians, they wanted to have, the Russians wanted, to breathe, to regenerate and reorganize their empire. So that's why the Russians, especially in the 90s, the Russians needed this idea in the West of, let's merge everything, let's all be friends and play nice, to get time, to buy the time necessary for Russia to become a serious threat again, it seems.
Yeah, it's interesting. Stubblebine, there was a Russian general who died about 10 years ago, and he had some writings, and I wrote an article about it last year. What I discovered, and it was when I was looking through some of these declassified U.S. files on Russian interest in the occult and UFOs, paranormal and UFOs, and this Russian general made some incredible statements. And of course, he was a guy involved in war plans, and he talked about UFOs as if there was this psychological warfare dimension to them that could be exploited in a devastating way against the West. And I think that this is what interests me, is the practical strategic aspects of the phenomenon. There's a book which has always fascinated people who are interested in these subjects. It's called Why UFOs by John A. Keel. Now, John A. Keel was a journalist. People might know him for the movie The Mothman Prophecies. He was Richard Gere plays John A. Keel in the movie, and it's a book that a sort of an autobiographical journalistic book that Keel wrote about his direct connection, his direct experience of very strange mind-bending phenomenon that was happening in West Virginia in the 1960s. And it involved people having visions of a future catastrophe, of people seeing UFOs and seeing a Mothman, and of course having nightmares. And this phenomenon basically, it ended up that Keel, and they depict this in the movie, thought that there was going to be a disaster in some kind of plant along the Ohio River because the prophecies indicated the river was connected to the disaster. Well, what did happen was a bridge collapsed on Christmas Eve loaded with Christmas shoppers coming back, going to the West Virginia side from the Ohio side into the Ohio River, and 30-something people died in that, drowned when that bridge collapsed. Their cars went into the water. And of course, Keel went on, though, to write this Why UFOs, and it's on the back book jacket of the book. It goes right to psychological warfare. And what's interesting is that Keel worked in the U.S. military in psychological warfare when he was in the U.S. military, which is another one of those things. Suppose the plan is to process millions of people and at some future date trigger those minds at one time. Would we suddenly have a world of saints or a world of armed maniacs shooting at one another from bell towers?
Interesting.
And he says the Air Force and the CIA are not in a conspiracy to silence the believers as the cultists claim. The experts were rendered mute by the awesome and overwhelming realization that man is not alone, that the human race is merely a trifling part of something bigger, something that could drive the human mind into madness. And of course, perhaps the most peculiar, he talks about demonology and the birth of spiritualism in this book, which is, and of course, he talks also about, in a book called The Eighth Tower, he talks about the intelligent electromagnetic spectrum, he calls it. But he has a chapter here called The Cosmic Jokers, in which he says, and I quote, and he talks about angels and devils, and this is really, it's quite frightening, things that go bump in the night. But he has a thing on demonology, and it says, demonology is not just another crackpotology. And he refers to it as a science. And so then you get to somebody like Whitley Strieber, the famous UFO abductee, who also had a great interest in the occult and dabbled in it. And this is a very strange thing. This is a strange book. And he had himself checked out medically because he thought he might have a brain tumor because what was happening to him. So this is Carla Turner's book, Into the Fringe. And Turner ended up doing a book which really was perhaps the most frightening book. And it was The Masquerade of Angels is the title of the book. I think it's hard to get now. But this book it's absolutely terrifying because it's about a individual who has psychic ability, an American, living in the South, who is plagued with demonic, kind of like UFO demonic phenomena that are really harming him, and his struggle with that. And it's about psychic rape. It really is about psychic rape. And that's what's so terrifying about it. And of course, what does this mean? Who is behind this? Is this being used by governments? Are there groups that use this? Is this thing just off on its own, right? And, are people trying to harness whatever this is?
Yeah, there's so many variables and so many operations that one could design. I mean, of course, as we said, for thousands and thousands of years, people have tried to be cutting edge and discover new things and have these breakthroughs. And sometimes, people get really inspired and discover something truly new. And of course, on the other hand, if you look at a guy like Bird Stubblebine, for example, there's a possibility that the Soviets may have thought, well, couldn't we find the Soviets may have thought, couldn't we just make people, just get people to go nuts, get people to do too many psychedelics? Can we get people to abandon the classic idea of warfare and just could we mess with their heads? Now, this, of course, is one of many things that may have went on at the time. And I have some notes here.
Go to Clausewitz.
And I have some notes here because if you think about it, I mean, Bird was a leading military intelligence guy. I mean, he was rare among a select group of people, and it was really a shame to see his career end like this. I mean, I heard that he was a candidate for the next director of the NSA, because it's always fluctuates between a civilian heading the NSA and a military guy, and so he could have done more great things, but instead he focused on these experiments he was interested in, and that led to a situation where civilians without a security clearance, they were apparently going in and out of these secure compartmented facilities, the so-called SCIFs. And so they probably thought, well, we're all working on the same goal here. It's fine, we're just bending a few rules or whatever. But to the military, this was a serious breach. And no matter who you are, if you let people into a SCIF, they could access potentially all kinds of stuff. And so from a baseline counterintelligence perspective, that was a serious problem. So, I mean,
and that is a problem with Americans.
Yeah.
And James Angleton, famous chief of the CIA counterintelligence staff for many years, made this statement that Americans do not take security measures and counterintelligence measures seriously. And evidently, Stubblebine didn't either.
Well, it's not. Yeah, I mean, I think the details never really came to light, but that ended his career. And I mean, just a few months ago, maybe it was a year ago, maybe it was more than a year ago, a young American soldier who had access to a SCIF, he was busted because he was downloading all kinds of material, and he was spreading it around. And I think there was another case with another SCIF. And so material was posted on the web in a forum, and this forum was frequented by Russian people. And so you saw these young soldiers, they go online and they get their head full of Russian propaganda. And so they start doing these things. They steal classified information, and then they hand it over to whomever. And so it was a sad ending to Bird's career, to think of it, and of course from a
did Stubblebine never mention Ingo Swann to you?
I don't recall that. No, I don't recall.
Because Ingo Swann was considered one of those. Now we talked about Uri Geller, and then we might just mention this for people that it is believed that Aleister Crowley of British occult fame was a secret agent.
Oh yeah,
I think you've mentioned that Gurdjieff,
the study,
the Russian, was a spy as well.
Correct.
I mean, is that actually true that Gurdjieff was a spy?
It's difficult to reconstruct, to reconstruct exactly the status of these famous, very, very famous
Did Ouspensky ever suggest that? Wasn't it Ouspensky that wrote a lot about Gurdjieff? He was a protege of Gurdjieff, wasn't he?
Yeah, there was also a tie to a leading British military intelligence officer. So again, just like Bird Stubblebine, who was in military. Yeah, hang on, I have this in my notes here. It's
interesting. Yeah,
I have it here.
This is interesting. I've heard of Gurdjieff, and of course, you hear about these people. I mean, he was maybe one of the most famous, along with Crowley, one of the most famous esotericists or occultists.
Yeah. So it says here,
of the 20th century.
It says here, in Istanbul, Gurdjieff also met his future pupil, Captain John G. Bennett, then head of the British Directorate of Military Intelligence in Constantinople, who describes his impression of Gurdjieff as follows. In Gurdjieff, East and West do not just meet, their difference is annihilated in a world outlook which knows no distinctions of race or creed. And according to Rom Landau, a journalist in the 1930s, Ahmed Abdullah told him at the beginning of the 20th century that Gurdjieff was a Russian secret agent in Tibet. and then of course, there's this discussion about his cover name because it was used by somebody else. So it's difficult. I have to look into this more.
You know who else was a Russian spy in Tibet? You may not know this,
No,
but Mannerheim,
really.
the Finnish marshal, famous Finnish defense minister, the victor of the Finnish Civil War, who defeated the Reds, who fought the Russians in the Winter War and again in the Continuation War during the Second World War, and ultimately was he president or prime minister of Finland? I think he was president of Finland.
Yeah.
After World War II. He started out, he was a military officer, I believe he was a cavalry officer, an ethnic Swedish Finn, and Finland was in the Russian Empire, so he was a Russian military officer who was assigned to Tibet and went to Tibet and befriended the Dalai Lama on an intelligence mission, and then of course went on to China, there's a recent biography of Mannerheim that I read a couple of years ago that I didn't even know this about him. But there was a lot of interest in Tibet, not only by the Russians, but by the Germans and by Adolf Hitler. And I don't know what you know about it, but the Ahnenerbe sent an expedition, I think it was in 37 or 38, to Tibet.
Yeah.
And allegedly they found something, but there's nothing about what they allegedly found there. Yeah. Have you ever heard of anything? And I've looked through several books and footnotes, and I can't find, they say they found something. What was it? It was like the only success that the Ahnenerbe had in looking for Atlantis, looking for the Holy Grail.
You can tell by,
for the roots of the Aryan race, right?
It seems fairly clear that when these different people meet, like Gurdjieff becomes the mentor of Captain John Bennett, head of British, military intelligence in Constantinople.
And what year was that?
This was I don't have a date here, but this was. So it describes the 1930s when the accusation was made that Gurdjieff was a secret agent. Gurdjieff was a Russian secret agent in Tibet.
That would mean he was a Soviet secret agent.
Yeah, exactly. And who went by the name of Hambro Akuan Dorjiev, a tutor to the Dalai Lama. And then there was some other guy they found who had the same name, and it's not exactly clear. I have to look more into that, but at least some people had their heads screwed on right. And they were thinking about espionage in connection with, this occultism. Right. And if you come up with these ideas, the East and West meet, and it's all like one thing. This opens all kinds of possibilities for espionage, and I think this is how Bird Stubblebine got entangled in all of this. One motive maybe was to ruin the career of a guy who was a really scientific anti-communist military intelligence guy. If the Russians or the Soviets, if they looked at America, if they looked at America's top intelligence guys, Bird Stubblebine was on the list. So they have their targets, they have their enemies, and they know Bird is one of these guys that we don't want in active service. How can we subvert him? This is what the Soviets could have been thinking.
In your recording, you showed in your video on Stubblebine, you showed a fairly long recording of Stubblebine in which it sounded as if Stubblebine had been turned against the capitalist system by someone because he had health problems and that he felt that we were being poisoned through our food.
Yeah, he actually, there's this one bit, and people can see this in the video I posted on Stubblebine and the 1st Earth Battalion. You see this one moment where he asks the question, how high do you have to be in the system, the American system or the capitalist system, to get real clean food and real clean medicine? Because he was having issues. He had these toxic dental fillings. Then he was worried about long-term effects of these vaccines he got in the military. Think about Vietnam, right? He was getting the vaccines back then against various things. He was worried about the long-term effects of certain foods because he was so busy all the time. He wasn't worried about what he was eating. But then when he got older, he sort of fell into this almost left-wing class warfare type
Hmm.
belief, where he thought,
So
well,
they,
he always thought
wow.
he was high enough in the system to be treated well, to get good medical care, and to get the clean food and all that. But then he thought he wasn't getting this. So this is one of the moments, I think, that's moments that stood out, that tells you a lot about his how he got turned against the system per se.
Yeah. Well,
Eh,
I'd like to comment a little bit on his comment about the food being poisoned because I've seen this poisoning. I've suffered from some of the effects of the food that we eat because I was um, I was given the wrong treatment by a doctor more than 30
mm,
years ago. Allopathic medicine is problematic. And one of the things I know Trevor Loudon, who is an expert on expert anti-communist, expert on communism, and a Colombian fellow whose name I don't have permission to get, have really studied this. And I knew that there was problems with toxins in our environment and our food, but they showed me that there is a connection to communist agents.
mm,
And the one that was the most striking, Trevor Loudon, I don't have the name in front of me, but there was a medical doctor who created the idea, going back, I think, to the late 40s or early 50s, that animal fat causes heart disease,
yeah,
right? Animal fat, a major part of the human diet for forever. For
was
that, I
animal
mean,
fat.
before we were eating grains, we were mainly only eating meat, right? We eat meat and a few berries and fruits and stuff. So what was really interesting is that this guy had communist connections. I think he was actually a Communist Party member, but I'd have to go back and ask Trevor again. But Trevor had talked about him, and of course, I was well aware because of my own health issues that there's nothing wrong with animal fat.
Yeah,
In fact, in this Colombian friend noted that, look, what do they do in a communist concentration camp? The first thing they do is they take animal fat out of your diet.
correct. Mm,
And if you
yeah,
read the Gulag Archipelago and you read about the grass soups that they would feed people, you would realize that in the starvation regiment of the camps, when they were trying to kill people, and they were trying to work people to death because they didn't want them to come back from the camps in many instances, they deprived them of that one part of their diet, animal fat. And of course, what's interesting in the case of the United States, once you got people scared of cholesterol, scared of eggs, scared of meat, um, what would they have left to fill that diet? What is most satisfying in the human diet is fat and meat. That's what feeds your brain. Your brain is made out of fat. That's what feeds your organs. So what do? They make these processed foods. They take the fat out of them and they put sugar into them.
yeah, or plant
And it turns
oil
out the
and
most
the
recent
worst.
studies show the cause of heart disease is elevated sugar, and sugar is a inflammatory, right? And the oils they use, the non-animal fat oils, are inflammatory, right? More so than regular animal fat. And so all of a sudden you realize you have removed something essential from the American diet, fat. Oh, it's
Yeah,
non-fat. Everything's got the non-fat yogurt, non-fat milk, and then you have, but to make it filling, to make it fill you up, they put the sugar in. Elevated blood sugar. You look, who has a higher heart attack rate? People with diabetes or without? I know people who've had diabetes, and they oftentimes die in their late 40s, early 50s,
mm,
because that elevated blood sugar is what really causes the plaque in the arteries. And famously, one of these guys who did hundreds and hundreds of bypass surgeries was struck by the fact that all these people he was doing bypass surgeries on, their arteries appeared inflamed to him. And that was the body was putting the plaque on the arteries, the fat and the cholesterol to soothe the arteries, to try to heal them because the inflammation was breaking them down. And that was sugar and these fats that shouldn't be in your body. So if this and you think about it, if a communist created this scientific hoax, and you think about global warming, you think about
Hmm.
nuclear winter was a hoax started by Andropov. Nuclear winter was a hoax. In fact, one of the Soviet scientists defected from the Soviet Union and said, "Yeah, Andropov's KGB put us up to it. It's not true. We were told to fabricate this." So they fabricated a hoax against animal fat. So you talk about poisoning. So Stubblebaum's not
Yeah.
wrong. Only he's blaming capitalism
Hmm.
rather than the
Yeah. I
infiltrators.
mean, I've
He
more
just
footage.
the
I've more footage of him, and
feels
he talks about food a lot, and just all this stuff. And this is kind of the topic that got him then into activism because of his wife. And I talk about how it seems like Bird Stubblebine was one of the most paradoxical characters ever. He was totally pro-government, patriot, then he turned anti-government. He married basically, or he got together with a woman who came out of the counterculture. He was in an activist organization with a woman who was fairly much to the left in many ways.
so
And
his wife was on the left.
yeah, I mean, she had some, the background basically, the rebellious '60s, 1960s spirit and all that. So this is what we saw, right from the start. How did they get together? How does a right wing or former right wing general, why does he end up with a woman who seems so different to him? And also the activism they were doing, we expected it to be structured like a military camp, but on the other hand, it was way too hippie. It was too hippie for us, and so this was not what we had expected. And he was not some person that's barking orders and demanding respect from everybody. No, he was just Bert. And I think that quite a few officers and intelligence people, quite a few of them were pretty burnt out after Vietnam, after some of these other operations. And I think this is one angle that the Soviets were playing. They tried to find these people who were frustrated, who were burnt out. And I think this is how Soviet intelligence tried to approach them through proxies and cutouts and middlemen, and to get them into these research programs on psychedelic treatments for PTSD and depression, and just lure them into something, and just to turn them against the system itself. I think this is one of the things we have to be looking at. But there's
And of course, the drug culture. You may be aware of Joseph D. Douglas Jr., who wrote a book called Red Cocaine. And
yeah,
I
I've heard
have
about that.
a copy of this book here. I was friends with Joe. He died about 10 years ago. And it was tremendous research that he did in this book, in Red Cocaine. It was a tremendous research. And Joe had a defector source, Jan Shena, the Czech defector. He was politically the highest ranking
Yeah.
defector from the communist apparatus in Eastern Europe. He knew Khrushchev, he knew Brezhnev personally, very, very high in the structures. And of course, he was aware of the chemical warfare program of the Soviet Union, which had been, because the Czechs were completely advanced. They were the most advanced country in the Eastern Bloc. And so the Russians said, look, we're going to throw away our chemical warfare ideas. We're going to adopt wholesale the Czech. And that they were looking at psychedelics. They were looking at truth drugs. But the interesting thing, the drug they developed that they thought was the most powerful was called the friendship drug.
Yeah.
Have you ever heard of this?
I have something in my notes here. It's something that something that was worked on in this circle that Stubblebine was getting into.
Yeah.
And
French.
they did. I mean, it is actually mentioned that they tried everything. I mean, they experimented with MDMA, which is ecstasy, and they tried to they tried all kinds of things. And if you mix it in the right way, and if you pick
Yes.
the right approach, you can actually change a person, or you can make the person trust you. And I mean, we have
It's
to
a
basic,
cocktail.
yeah, and
Yes.
we have to look at quite a few, quite a large number of Americans that may have been targeted by Soviet operations, tailored operations. You know, sometimes they could target somebody who was older and established, because you know, when you get older, there's always something that you can be you could regret, or something you're mad about, you know, and just you can tailor your approach. And then you have to look at the children, because if somebody you know, if somebody becomes influential and important and professional, you could target his children, you know, and turn them onto drugs, and turn them onto stupid ideas, and just tailor.
Yes.
You find the right targets, and you find the right approach, and you find the right drugs. And you know, this is something that is probably potentially more powerful in terms of, you know, destructive effect, more powerful than your standard trader, you know, your standard
It's very powerful.
mole.
Let me explain a few things that Douglas discovered in his research. In debriefing Shana, he also did research, and of course, the OSS was trying to develop a truth drug during World War II. You'll never guess what the truth drug they settled on was. Can you guess?
Well, they tried a lot of things, but
Marijuana. Marijuana.
well, yeah, they did some
Marijuana,
sort of
and they got the notion that people under the influence of marijuana, they loosened up, and
mm,
that if they were questioned, they could not really resist telling you what you wanted. And so they experimented. As you know, the OSS was working towards the invasion of Sicily at one point in the war, and the Italian mafia in New York was helping with their connections in Sicily. And this one particular mobster who was suspected of having committed this murder, which they could never get the evidence on, they did an experiment. They decided to lace his cigarette with marijuana, and then have an expert detective posing as an OSS officer question him once they realized he was under the influence. Now, they didn't prosecute him. It was an experiment,
yeah,
and it worked. He smoked a cigarette. He didn't realize what was in it, and he gave away. He actually told about the murder.
yeah,
So this experiment proved to be successful. So marijuana becomes a very important drug right there. And of course, in making a cocktail, depending on what you want your drug to do, you're going to do this. Now, there's another drug we're all familiar with, well, many of us who are older, if you've had a colonoscopy or certain procedures, medical procedures, um, they give you a drug that really doesn't,
yeah, the
you don't
benzos,
lose consciousness, right?
yeah,
But you remember nothing from it's like in a colonoscopy, if you've ever had one. You come in, you seem to fade away, you come back awake, but you've been awake the whole time. You just don't remember anything. Well, this is the effect of the friendship drug. You take a guy to dinner, you salt his food and his drink with it. You're talking to him. He's conscious, he's talking, he's animated, but he's not remembering anything he's saying or that's happening to him. And if you combine that effect with a drug that there's a drug that basically paralyzes the critical faculty in the brain, the part of the brain that says, I don't believe that. And if you do that, when a person's under the influence of this drug, they believe everything you tell them is the truth, uncritically, while they're under the influence. And when they wake up, or well, they are awake, but when they come to themselves, they have been reprogrammed.
yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, if there was when a tiny little fraction of the documents were released to or declassified to the public about the whole MK Ultra program, people tend to forget that the later programs, they were getting into, I think it was thousands, maybe in tens of thousands of substances that were experimented on. And so when you just read the standard literature on MK Ultra, you get a fraction of the picture, because you have to sort of, use deduction and fill in some of the blanks, because they were not just experimenting with LSD the whole time and then discarded it. But they had a system of trying different substances in different environments with different people, connected with other factors. So this was almost like the Manhattan Project, when they had to enrich uranium or make plutonium. There were so many different stages, and they kind of knew, from going from A to Z, but all the steps in the middle, there were so many permutations and variations. They had to try out everything. So that's why you have like this project matrix, and you try out every permutation necessary until you find what works and what doesn't. And there's something in the literature about people reacting differently to all kinds of drugs. And so, for example, when you make inquiries about a person, you could find out how he reacts to alcohol, how he reacts to this and that. And the experts could then actually read more, or they could gauge more information out of this. So seemingly innocuous little facts about a person can then, tell a much more detailed story. So, for example,
and let me
you
give
manage
you an example.
Yeah, one example because you mentioned these knockout, semi-dream state knockout drugs. They had to give me 3 doses, and I was still there. I was still lucid with the 3rd dose. So
you were not affected by it. Yeah,
they were surprised by it. So everybody reacts differently. That's why they had to do so many experiments on people.
And the differences aren't only physiological, they're psychological. For example, friendship drugs, which I just told you about, they don't work on people who are modest or humble. They are best used on people who are narcissistic and they're very egotistical, which is interesting. And you might say, well, why would a drug that basically reprograms you work on an egotistical person? Why would an egotistical person be easier to reprogram than a humble person? Because humble people, modest people, have more self-awareness.
They're more complex.
And they question themselves. So an egotist immediately thinks if it comes out of his mouth, it's gold. So if you've reprogrammed him and he's now spontaneously spouting what you put in his brain, he's thinking, well, I'm a genius. I don't question myself.
Yeah.
I just go with it, right? Whereas the humble person goes, I didn't used to think that. Where's that coming from? And then they examine themselves, and it doesn't work. The programming doesn't work. And of course, they evaluate the personality of the target. They're not going to try it on somebody who's self-questioning or humble. They're going to use it on an egomaniac, which is absolutely fascinating when you think about it.
Yeah, and of course, these experiments that Bird Stubblebine was doing, and the circles he was moving in, and his connections, and this wider net, this wider circle. I mean, you do get the sense that this overlapped with some of the work and research done by the CIA. Now, at the time, the CIA was infiltrated. They had these disastrous moles. These traders, and so that makes it all the more dangerous, the stuff they've done. So because you may think you're among friends, you're among leading researchers from the big universities, and they're doing work with veterans that are burnt out and depressed, and so it seems like they're your friends. So it's not like in a classic interrogation situation where you're focused on not telling what you think, not telling what you know. But if you think you're among friends and then you're on some drugs, that's a whole different story. And so we got this character here. His name was Lieutenant Colonel Jim Channon. And so Channon was sort of recruiting Stubblebine for all this. And Channon was kind of into the New Age stuff, and he came up with the First Earth Battalion Field Manual. It's almost like a PowerPoint presentation on paper. And so Shannon was connected to people from the Human Potential Movement, and this also tied into the weird Esalen Institute, which brought in the most, famous psychiatrists and speakers and writers like Aldous Huxley. All these LSD fans, they loved LSD, and so they wrote this 125-page operations manual for a proposed First Earth Battalion, and the main loyalty of these new super soldiers, the main loyalty was towards planet Earth, not the United States population, not the Constitution, not the system. No, it was Earth, and
which is a very strange, because there is no such thing in political terms as the Earth. If I pledge allegiance to the Earth, what am I pledging allegiance to?
That means nothing.
It's
yeah,
a big nothing. There is no such allegiance.
Exactly, and so. After retiring from the army, this Shannon guy, he went to these big corporations like AT&T and DuPont and others, and he spread his New Age stuff, and they called him a corporate shaman. Now, of course, AT&T was tied into, it was not just a telecommunications giant, it was also tied into the surveillance program was tied into the NSA. As we heard, Bird Stubblebine almost became the next head of the NSA. Now, of course, any Russian, all Russian, all Soviet intelligence, of course, they try to get into AT&T, try to get into the DuPont company, because they were making, all sorts of high-tech stuff. And so, wouldn't that be a nice way of getting into these corporations if you use the New Age as a conduit? Because what do we see nowadays? All the CEOs and the big shots of the technological corporations, they love psychedelic drugs. They go to these festivals and they have these private parties doing psychedelics. And so wouldn't that be a smart thing for communist intelligence to get into this action and to establish these New Age characters and then get close to these people?
And here is where you have this connection between, and you mentioned Aldous Huxley, this connection between drug use, certain drug use, and supernatural experience or mystical experiences, where people see God, or they have enlightenment, or they have something that occurs to them. And so you had, after the 1960s, especially in the 1970s, you have things like LifeSpring. You have all these, you have EST, you have all these things where people are attempting through meditation or hypnosis or drugs to reach this altered state, this state of heightened awareness and enlightenment, spiritual insight, whatever you want to call it. And this was really big back in those days.
Yeah, and so, especially with the drugs. I mean, I recently saw an interview with one of the, some rock band guy who was just all about the tradition of the 1960s, the counterculture rebellion. And he said something like, the average Christian in America, they talk to God and they don't hear back, and they keep begging for things. But his kind, the occultist rock musician type, what they do is they just take a bunch of drugs and then they meet, or they think they meet these supernatural entities. So this is something that that was kind of the allure for many people, that you get to get this kind of an experience that you couldn't get anywhere else. And so this human potential movement that I mentioned, tied to these military guys, tied to these researchers, tied to this Esalen Institute, this human potential movement came out of the counterculture of the 1960s, and this Michael Murphy guy and Dick Price founded the Esalen Institute in 1962, and Aldous Huxley gave lectures on the human potential at Esalen in the early 1960s. He was writing about mystical dimensions of psychedelics. He called it the perennial philosophy and that stuff. uh, and um, and so yeah, and then of course these people, they introduced all this Eastern mythology to the United States. So the I Ching, the Buddhism, the Zen, meditation techniques, the yoga, right? So all this Eastern mythology was brought into the United States, and this Esalen Institute founder Dick Price lived in San Francisco with the Taoist teacher Jia Fu Feng, who was born in Shanghai. And Price experimented with LSD in the 1960s, administered by a psychiatrist. And later he discovered that so-called empathogens, such as MDMA, ecstasy, facilitated self-exploration and were helpful in psychological healing when used in conjunction with therapy. Now, that's all correct. Now, these days, more studies are being done, microdosing these substances under supervision of, professional, medical personnel. But there's also some other stuff you could do with these drugs. And there's some other stuff, foreign intelligence services could do with this knowledge. And so how much of the CIA research, or generally American research, how much of that stuff was given to the Soviets, by the moles? That would be an interesting question.
Yeah, well, of course, the reason that the CIA got involved in this this whole area of mind control was in the 1950s. Alan Dulles went before a group of intelligence officials and said, "Look, we've made the discovery the Soviets are way ahead of us in this area of mind control drugs and mind control techniques, hypnosis, whatever, chemicals. And it's dangerous that we fall behind. In those days, they talked about a missile gap or whatever. We were behind. We were behind in this area. I don't think we ever have caught up, by the way, because we just don't. Our way of thinking is not tuned to this. And of course, Dulles was always problematic, and it was in Trento's book, The Secret History of the CIA. He interviewed Angleton, and Angleton was afraid that Dulles himself had been compromised by the Russians, and he was the deputy of General Walter Bedell Smith. We've mentioned this before, that Smith had to be removed by Eisenhower, or rather tricked by Eisenhower into resigning as the head of the CIA because he had fallen under suspicion by the FBI of being a Soviet agent. So you had these, like you say, these massive problems in the CIA, very poor counterintelligence, infiltration, exploitation of homosexuals, by the way, at the CIA, very famous cases going on, and in the State Department. You had the Rosenbergs, you had the leaking of the atomic bomb project, the Manhattan Project, leaked like a sieve from all kinds of directions, from scientists, from, people like the Rosenbergs, who were very low level. They were the ones that fried for it, not the high level guys. So it was a terrible thing. But other than these nuclear secrets, these mind control and paranormal secrets, and the combined understanding of this opens this other level of warfare, psychological warfare, you could call it occult warfare. And what the Russians really became interested in, of course, you have Gnostic ideas of which, Eric Voegelin has characterized Marxism in general as a revolt, as a kind of Gnostic idea. But what really fascinated the Russians and the Soviets, and fascinates the Russians now, is Hermeticism. And you see it in people like Alexander Dugin, whose original circle that he was in Moscow, maybe it was always under control of the KGB. It's certainly those people, many of them were recruited, the Yuzhinsky circle, was Hermetic rather than Gnostic. Now, what does that mean, and why Hermeticism? Because Hermeticism claims that it goes back to a civilization that, to ancient Egypt, to Thoth, Hermes, right, is the Egyptian name is Thoth, goes back to Egypt, which is taken it from a previous civilization, an antediluvian civilization, or a pre-flood civilization, right? And this idea is extremely, you could say it's on the rise, from whether it's from Eric van Daniken or It's from a lot of these books. And this started in the Renaissance when books from Constantinople were taken out as the Turks were advancing against this last fragment of the Roman Empire in the 15th century. These Hermetic books made it to Italy, and the Medici family, banking family in Florence, got a hold of something called the Asclepius. I don't know if you're familiar with this book. And there's
No.
other Hermetic works. And these works claimed great antiquity, although they think they were written in the 1st or 2nd centuries AD, although recent archaeological discoveries indicate that maybe the information does go way back into Egypt. But these teachings are essentially monotheistic, which is fascinating. Shades of Akhenaten, the pharaoh who tried the revolution for monotheism in Egypt. But the teachings are esoteric and occult. And I think there's something called the Kabbalion, and I think it's 7 principles they're like metaphysical, it's like a metaphysical teaching. And the first one is the universe is mind, which is interesting. It reminds me of Donald Hoffman, right? Saying the universe is mind. And of course, the ultimate mind is God in this setting. And of course, at the time, the Medicis were paying to translate all kinds of works, and they kind of dropped everything for this because this became the thing. And of course, a lot of modern occultism is connected to Hermeticism. And Alexander Dugin was, and I know this from people I know that knew him back in the Soviet Union, was a follower of Aleister Crowley. Right? The author of the book Magic, the British occultist.
And a spy.
Yeah. And of course, his relationship to L. Ron Hubbard and a rocket scientist named Parsons, who conjured a little man, what do you call him? In the desert in New Mexico in 1945, 46. And Parsons later blew himself up. He was trying to go into the ammunition business or the explosive business and blew himself up in Pasadena. But he's one of the founders of our modern rocket space industries, but was very heavily, along with L. Ron Hubbard, involved in the occult. And I think there's a letter extant where Crowley, for them to, it was a homunculus that they summoned. And this homunculus was one that Crowley had supposedly summoned with a German woman in New York in January 1918. And this is bizarre, but Crowley wrote a letter. What did those fools do? Did they close the portal after they summoned this thing, right? So Crowley was, this is really dangerous. You can't play around with this stuff. You're going to tear a fabric in the universe, tear a hole in the universe, kind of thing. And you wonder, well, how seriously can you take this? But the Russians, Crowley, being so deeply involved in this, became this major voice trying to influence I guess you could call it the alt-right occult, even neo-Nazi, or I don't know, there's all kinds of shades of ideology out there, especially in Europe, and also racist. And of course, Dugan denies being a Nazi, denies being a racist, denies being an anti-Semite, but he's flirting with all these people, right? He's trying to influence these people.
I mean, he loves anything radical, anything crazy. I mean, he actually hates normal things, normal thoughts.
Yes, he does. And there's a quote from his book, The Fourth Political Theory. I'll just read it to you. If the fourth political practice is not able to realize the end of times, then it would be invalid. The end of days should come, but it will not come by itself. This is a task. It is not a certainty. It is active metaphysics. It is a practice, right? So he's trying to bring about the end of times. And it's like a magical operation. Is this not disturbing?
Yeah, and there were some observers who noticed during the alt-right phase, during the Trump administration, and during the political campaign, some people noticed that in right-wing circles, some right-wing circles, and people thought they were actually performing some sort of chaos magic by posting certain memes and images and statements. So this was not just activism, you spread and multiply a message or a meme. They thought it was almost like chanting. It was like ritualistically casting a spell, and just the more people got involved, the more powerful the spell would be. And some people were convinced that this sort of chaos magic helped Trump win over Hillary, even though Hillary had been leading the polls. So some people take this very seriously. And also, there was a study, I think it's fairly recently, and I quoted this a couple of times. It was a study on psychedelics in right-wing circles nowadays. I mean, not just the new right-wing, the alt-right, the pro-Russian types, but also kind of all kinds of right circles. And so they looked at all these statements, systematically were reviewing what people said about themselves and each other, and it turns out that all your major influencers, they're all into this stuff. They all like this stuff. And I noticed at some point when Alex Jones, for example, when he sort of had this shift concerning certain things. I mean, he used to dislike David Icke, and then he had David Icke on as a guest multiple times.
David Icke's perspective is very Gnostic, because he conceives of these things that are really the same thing as archons, right?
Yeah, and also
these reptilians.
Yeah, and also what I noticed in David Icke's books, because I have a fairly large library, and I also have his books, and in public he talks about he did talk about he doesn't like people being threatened and people that are being made to feel guilty. So this is kind of a jab against Christianity, because in his view it's just guilt tripping and threatening, right? But then he does this 180, and he explains his supernatural idea of how the universe works. And he basically tells the reader that everything's your fault. If you don't take part in this positive magic, if you don't take part in these rituals, if you don't become a member of his group or whatever, if you don't join in this magic, then you are helping the bad spirits. And so this is how he's guilt tripping his own audience, and how he's threatening the audience, because if bad things happen, well, it's because you didn't do enough magic. I mean, this is in his books. And also he said that...
of course, notice how similar this is to the Aztecs, sacrificing people, ripping hearts out of people to keep the sun close to the earth, to keep things warm. That if they don't sacrifice to their Moloch, the earth's going to get cold, and everybody's going to die.
Yeah, I mean, and he was a guy. I mean, I'm trying to be as objective as I can here, because he had a very troubling childhood. There was some extreme poverty, and it was a highly stressful environment, and so he was always on edge. He was never feeling secure. So he didn't like reality, and so at some point,
that's a Gnostic trait, by the way.
Yeah, and so then he became good at soccer, and he had he could have made it as a professional soccer player, but then his health failed him. So he has this this joint disease, and so he couldn't follow this professional soccer career. So this was another bad thing that happened to him. It was not his fault, but he hates reality. And so then he rebuilds his life yet again. And he becomes this television presenter. So he has this new career. And for various reasons, he's still depressed. He still hates reality. And that's when he wants to try out something new, which I think is what happened to Bird Stubblebine. He wanted to try out something new. I think he booked this trip to maybe South America, one of the
I
other
think he
places,
went to Peru, actually.
or Peru. It was one of these places.
He went to
Yeah,
the Cusco
and
ruins.
he drank this ancient concoction which they make, and had this multi-hour long extreme trip, and then of course he was also consuming theosophical literature. He was consuming, standard conspiracy literature, and this was the mixture of factors that went into his transformation.
And
And
it kind of retrained his brain, didn't it?
yeah, and so he's preaching that you shouldn't fight evil by standard means. You're supposed to spread love through magic and all that stuff, which sounds pretty much like the First Earth Battalion manual, that stuff that Bird Stubblebine was getting into, where we're going to have a multicultural, what they call it, rainbow force, and we're going to just save every problem and not have traditional warfare.
It sounds like the Beatles. All you need is love.
Exactly.
Da, 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 da.
Exactly.
So is love. Yeah.
So this is something that you could find in shaped to a different target audience. This is what you find for left-wing people, right-wing people, mainstream people. It's a very big program, and I was surprised to find that I never even heard about this Esalen Institute, which spread all kinds of stuff. And
now,
they were also
was there
connected.
a communist or Russian connection to the Esalen Institute?
Some connections, yes. I mean that I could find, and they also had this.
What were those connections? I'm intrigued.
Well, first of all, it was this thing that started in 1979, the Soviet American exchange program.
So they came out of that.
Yeah, Esalen. It was this weirdo esoteric institute which launched a Soviet American exchange program, and they brought one of Gorbachev's chief economic advisors to the United States. They brought Boris Yeltsin on his first trip to the United States, and Esalen also arranged meetings for Yeltsin with President George H.W. Bush. And there's some other connections as well.
They never closed that portal once they opened it, huh?
Not really. And so there's more connections to, let's say, communism, the Soviet Union, and also, as I mentioned before, with this Gurdjieff occultist who was then teaching a British military intelligence officer. This intelligence officer said, well, according to the teachings of Gurdjieff, there's no distinction between East and West. East and West are coming together. They're not just coming together, they become one thing. And so this is where it gets really, really dangerous. And so here in 1973, Mr. Price from this institute he founded, Mr. Price was instrumental in bringing Stanislav Grof to Esalen as a scholar in residence. And Stanislav Grof came out of communist Czechoslovakia. And then you had all these Germans coming to Esalen. And of course, Germany was completely infiltrated. So the universities, the research, Germany was infiltrated. Not as bad as Britain, but
Germany and Italy are the two most infiltrated countries by Russia in Europe.
And so Germany, we had so many occultists, and we had so many scientists, and we had so many scientists who were occultists, and so suddenly these Germans, they come to America, and people will remember the sleeper cell strategy of the Soviets. The way they've done it. They will find selected people in the Soviet Union, they recruit them, they train them, then they bring them to Eastern Germany, and then Western Germany, and then Canada, and then the United States. So, or they find someone, they recruit someone from Western Germany, and then bring him to the United States. And so everybody has to be aware of that. And so in 1964, German psychiatrist Fritz Perls came to the Esalen Institute, and also the infamous Abraham Maslow was attached to it. I think he came up with this pyramid of needs, something like that. And
hierarchy of needs.
Yeah, exactly, the hierarchy of needs, and also the what was it, the dog training that this was, I think it was,
That
there was
was
also this,
Pavlov's
it was
dogs, and that's
Pavlov dogs training.
behaviorism.
Exactly,
Yeah,
behaviorism.
B.F. Skinner was the American version of that.
And then you had Aldous Huxley. In early 1953, Huxley had his first experience with the psychedelic drug mescaline. He had initiated a correspondence with Dr. Humphrey Osmond, a British psychiatrist then employed in a Canadian institution, and eventually asked him to supply a dose of mescaline. And they were experimenting with this in Southern California. After the publication of The Doors of Perception, in which he recounted this experience, Huxley and Swami Prabhavananda disagreed about the meaning and importance of the psychedelic drug experiments. And then, of course, Huxley moved over to LSD. He became an advisor to Timothy Leary and Richard Alpert in their early 1960s research work with psychedelic drugs at Harvard. Now, of course, people were genuinely interested in these drugs, and there was, of course, this hope, which was a naive hope, that if everybody just takes these drugs and everybody gets into this, new age stuff, we may have world peace at some point. So this was kind of one of the driving forces behind this, I guess.
And I would not be surprised if Dugan. I mean, getting back to Dugan, the sort of magician, propagandist spy who was part of this Uzinsky circle in the Soviet Union. Who this circle, their idea was to bring about the end of days.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, what that came to mean as it evolved in his philosophy was, if you look at communist philosophy, if you look at Karl Marx, the revolution is the end of days. That is when the order, the structure of the universe changes, and it's no longer the bourgeoisie, the middle class as the rulers, but the proletariat. And then you're going to have this magical transition where humanity enters a kind of utopia. But this Uzinsky circle used, and this goes back to this belief in an antediluvian paradise, Eden or Atlantis, however you want to put it. And so they believed that they would follow the footsteps of Nimrod and construct the Tower of Babel, if this sounds familiar. And so Dugan, this is interesting about the Tower of Babel. Remember, humanity, according to this story, was all one, and God didn't want them building the tower to reach heaven. So God confused them and broke them into all these different languages, right? And scattered humanity. So Dugan's idea, part of his idea, is to intellectually link all cultures and traditions, except Western culture and tradition, which Dugan says must be eradicated, and the territories of the West need to be absorbed. And this Uzinsky circle, as Eric Verglen might say, it's dedicated to humanitizing the Gnostic eschaton, or the Hermetic eschaton in this case. And it is really, it believes in a kind of second coming, only it's not a second coming of Christ. It's a second coming of, you could say, Antichrist. And there is a decapitation of being, in that there's an attempt to destroy the world as it is in order to create a new one. And Dugan, the Dugan biographer, James Heiser, he wrote a very interesting book. I think the title is America Should Be Destroyed. That might be the subtitle. But it's Dugan's taking of the statement of Cato the Elder before the Senate. Carthage must be destroyed. He'd end all his speeches that way. And Dugan was taking this up. And his Uzinsky circle, they were given access to this special Lenin library, which had the Soviet Union's occult archive in it. This is forbidden literature on Masonry, fascism, and paganism, Nazi paganism too. And this Uzinsky circle, having access to this, meant that there was an obvious connection to the KGB and special services in this. And there's a lot of the things they did, of course, are not translated into, I've had people translate some of it into English for me, but it doesn't exist in the English language. But it's Madame Blavatsky it's touched on in it. The secret doctrine
Yeah.
stuff, and it's it's and the Uzinski circle called themselves the Black Order of the SS
No, I did
privately.
not know that. I do remember
So
that.
very strange. And of course, Dugan went on to be the co-founder of the what do they call it? The National Bolshevik Party,
Yeah.
which kind
Yeah.
of failed. But you see that these are experiments. The fourth political theory is an experiment in creating a right-wing form of Marxism, apocalyptic Marxism,
Yeah.
and to destroy the West. And he is consciously using magic right out of Crowley to help him accomplish this.
Yeah.
So it
And
has this
and he's always about
side to
this. He's about this anger, anger type magic. And I remember from a book about this was sort of I think this is from a publishing house that does all kinds of anti-communist literature, and they had this study on Dugin, and I remember these experiments that Dugin's group was performing with themselves essentially, and some of these people actually died because they had to keep pushing and pushing with the alcohol and the drugs and who knows what else, because this was not just in the Crowley tradition. You have to go beyond your human normal perceptions or your normal standards. But this was also
even
sort
into
of
the
to
anti-human.
see. It was also to see who was committed enough. Who was actually committed enough for this and who would take these risks. And this is how they found a select group of survivors. Who could move on with this stuff. And so this was sort of he's always about the hatred. There was texts from Dugin where he describes his adoration for any sort of fanatic. If it's a Muslim fanatic, that's fine with him. If Muslim fanatics, if they kill Americans, that's good for him. If somebody is a psycho and is just going nuts in his prison cell, that's cool for him. That's kind of the anger magic. And on the other hand, you see people being ensnared with this idea of love magic, that this is something to recruit people with this idea of love magic. And for example, when I watched this famous Hollywood movie called Interstellar, it's a science fiction movie by Christopher Nolan. I think he's now Sir Christopher Nolan. And it's about this, the Earth is dying because of, they don't say it, but it's probably because of global warming. And so food is running out, there's this dust everywhere. So humanity is in a very, very bad situation. And the scientists from NASA and other American, entities, the scientists, they have a twofold strategy. One, they have to solve this almost impossible calculation to save humanity, and the other plan is to find a new Earth, another inhabitable planet. And they have very few possible candidates, and they have to send out spaceships and look at these planets and then report back if this is another Earth or not. If it's too cold or if it's just water. And this movie was basically a giant love letter to the British Royal Society and Freemasonry and sort of this blend of world-leading science and ancient mystery cults. And the happy ending comes about because of this love magic, because love travels through these dimensions, travels through the universe, and sort of communicates, between the dimensions. And this is how they save save Earth and save humanity, save humanity. And so there's always
there's a psychic paranormal dimension to it.
Yeah, and
right?
The climax of the movie takes place in a hyperdimensional, what they call a hypercube or a tesseract, and it's just in between times and spaces and stuff. So people noticed it's a love letter to science, but it's also very, very, very esoteric. And when I looked at this Esalen Institute that I've never even heard about, I found all these leading people inviting, Soviets to come over. They bring in this Eastern mythology to the United States. And then you had this character here called Alan Watts, English-American writer.
Oh, yes.
He
Alan
attended,
Watts was a very charismatic.
yeah,
I knew someone who was friends with him, but I
handsome
never
guy,
met him.
handsome-looking guy, if I remember. And he attended the King's School in Canterbury. He missed his opportunity to get into Oxford, and then he spent his time with the Buddhist lodge, and also under the tutelage of a rascal guru named Dmitry Mitrinovich. And that guy was attached to the British New Age magazine alongside Ezra Pound. And we talked about Pound before. He was tied to the fascists.
Ezra Pound, who lived in Mussolini's Italy, got put in jail for being a pro-Axis propagandist during World War II.
Yeah, and he ended up in a mental institution, and he was contacted by the guy.
Yes.
He was contacted by Eustace Mullins, who wrote the conspiracy book about the central bank Federal Reserve, right? And so, and this Mitrinovich,
it's the conspiracy thing intertwines with the occult thing, and and I should add, and Dugin makes use of this, of course. In this mixing of Marxism, Leninism, the occult, elements of fascism, elements of Madame Blavatsky, elements of Hermeticism, and so on. And in the book, The Fourth Political Theory, Dugin, and I'll get this is going to sound very woke, he seeks to overcome white European man through global egalitarianism. Sound familiar?
Oh boy.
This isn't classic Marxism, as Marx wasn't an egalitarian, but it's really designed to appeal to Western leftists. And of course, the Soviets found this long ago as a useful psychological weapon for subverting Western institutions, since egalitarianism is inherently destructive of social order. So it's not surprising that Dugin, as an alleged traditionalist, says that white European males are enemies of tradition because white European males uphold liberalism, right? Which he calls the first political theory. And
wait a minute. Oh boy.
But the other interesting thing, aside from being against white males, very predictably, is that Dugin says that gender identity must be broken. Now this book, The Fourth Political Theory, I think this was published 20 years ago. I mean, this thing came out, maybe it's longer than that, a long time ago. And now we see how gender identity is being broken. How would he know? I mean, did he cause that? No, there must be other forces working on the same project. He's just enunciating it as a philosopher. And Dugin, he claims, he makes Western liberalism into a straw man. And he describes it as, well, it's racism, sexism, classism, right? Just like a communist professor would call it. And so, and of course, he's talking about this postmodern re-extension. But this is what Dugin wrote. He said, the final breaking of gender, the stages of this break are feminism, homosexuality, sex change operations, and transhumanity. And that's a quote from the book, The Fourth Political Theory.
That is nuts. I mean, yeah, don't people realize how contradictory this whole thing is when, on the one hand, the left is saying, well, these white people in, market liberal capitalism, these white people, they form these dynasties, and it's so old school, and it's pure evil, and it can always be evil, and there's these hierarchies, so we have to destroy that. And then Dugin, supposedly from the right, Dugin says, well, this liberalism is just, must be destroyed, but then not be destroyed. But which is it? Which is it? So is Western culture, is it backwards and dynasties? But then some of the right wingers here in Germany, for example, some of the right wingers, they only read portions of Dugin's stuff, tailored for them, and then they think that, well, Dugin is going and Russia is going to help us regain empires, traditional empires here in Europe with dynasties. And I'm like, which is it? I mean, they just
And you
completely,
got Alex Jones interviewing and drooling over
yeah,
Alexander Dugin, right?
yeah. But then
Um,
Jones doesn't read books, so what does he know?
no, Jones doesn't realize what Dugin is actually saying. And see, it's very Crowleyist because if there's a very creepy part. If you were to get a copy of Crowley's book Magic, Crowley talks about in the book this ultimate magical operation where you basically murder millions and millions of people at one time. And then you can harness the destruction of all these people. You can create magical energy out of it or something. I guess you could harvest it in some way. And it's actually spelled out in his book, if you
Yeah.
can think of something so creepy. And Dugin, I mean, what I was told is that in Dugin's circle in Moscow back in the 80s, some of these kids that were enchanted by this, their fathers were generals in the strategic
Mm.
rocket forces
Oh wow.
that would make such a magical operation possible, right? You launch all the missiles, they strike all the cities exactly at once, you kill millions and millions of people all at once, and you turn it into a magical, the end of time,
Ritual.
the end time,
Yeah.
right? The end of time.
Yeah. So yeah, these guys, that became so important for the Russians and the Dugin. So this Mitrinovich guy was influenced by the Russian Peter Demyanovich Uspensky and G.I. Gurdjieff. And Uspensky spent time in London and was attached to the wife of Lord Rothermere. Now, the Rothermeres are really powerful and really influential. So, why would the wife of Lord Rothermere, why would she spend time with this Uspensky character? This is noteworthy. I mean, the Rothermeres, they were not just involved in the newspaper business, but they also, I think, they had something to do with the Air Force and what they called the Air Ministry and things of that nature. And in Istanbul, as I said, Gurdjieff met his future pupil, Captain John G. Bennett, head of the British Directorate of Military Intelligence in Constantinople. And some Muslim sources said that Gurdjieff was a Russian secret agent in Tibet. And so, then this East Salin Institute Soviet-American exchange program happened. They also had exchange programs with China, communist China. And and then you had this character called Stuart Brand, an American writer, best known as the editor of the Whole Earth catalog. He was heavily into LSD and the rock bands, and Steve Jobs from Apple ended his 2005 address at Stanford University by acknowledging both Stuart Brand and the Whole Earth catalog. And this catalog was an inspiration for the 1st Earth Battalion Operations Manual by U.S. Army Lieutenant Colonel and New Age futurologist Jim Channon. And Jim Channon got Bird Stubblebine into this whole thing. And Channon declared that the 1st Earth Battalion's primary allegiance was to the planet Earth. And you asked the question, what is that supposed to mean? And and they were talking about structure without status, unity powered by diversity, and members would be multicultural, with each race contributing to rainbow power. What is rainbow power? What does that even mean? And he also proposed as a guiding principle that members of the 1st Earth Battalion seek non-destructive methods of conflict resolution because their first loyalty is to the planet. Really?
Mm-hmm.
And so...
Yeah, by the way, which gets you to drop your actual allegiance to your own country.
Yeah.
Which now is not defended if you happen to be a general like Mr. Stubblebine. Do you think General Stubblebine was no longer that this planet Earth thing, he took it seriously and that he really was a devotee of some strange new ideology?
Well, I think that he was at a point in his life and his career where he was questioning everything because of how the Vietnam War went, the fight against, the fight against communism and the Soviet Union, how that went. He didn't know for the longest time in his career. He didn't know about the moles because, Robert Hansen and Aldrich Ames, they were uncovered quite late. So, this frustration that he felt was probably used to recruit him. This sense of wanting something new and trying out new things to solve the conflicts, on a global scale. I think he was just at that point in his life where it was easier to recruit him for that. And but he still there was still the patriot in him. There was still that warrior in him that never left him. But they sort of molded it so he would live with this contradiction. On the one hand, being a warrior, and on the other hand, being this sort of peacenik, almost hippie type character.
We talked about Lyndon LaRouche and the fashioning of the U.S. Labor Party and the LaRoucheite movement being a right-wing Marxist movement. And according to James Heiser in his biography on Dugan, he talks about Pomyat, that is a sort of an anti-Semitic right-wing Russian group. He said that this Pomyat was supported by highly placed individuals in the Central Committee of the KGB, Central Committee, the KGB, and the armed forces, the whole triangle, the whole elite of the Soviet system in the 80s. And he said that it basically appears that they were trying this experiment on Russian soil, that is to synthetically find a way to align the far right with communist objectives. And and we can find this attempt to combine the Nazis with the communists in South America, in the Nazi diaspora, in 1939 and 40, in the sort of the Hitler-Stalin pact of the time, and this idea of appropriating far right ideas and then making them amenable to the left is one of the central things that we're seeing right now. I mean, I think you can see it. I think you can speak to this in Germany. I can speak to this in the United States. It's very alarming to me because now suddenly you have people who were conservatives a couple of years ago or on the right who now sound like they're on the left, but they still think they're on the right, right?
Yeah. And so I have a quote here. It's a text from Alexander Dugin, and this was during the COVID pandemic, interestingly enough, and he was emphasizing the benefits of people dying actually from a disease, and I have to translate this on the fly, back to to English because I only have the German version here. And so he said he was beginning to understand why in older civilizations, why these gods of pestilence and disease, why these gods were worshipped. And so because a disease makes it possible to renew societies, an epidemic or disease has no logic, and it does not discriminate between poor people and rich people. The disease kills indiscriminately, and the disease also brings people back to the simplicity of just being. That's how he called it. And the disease gods are the most just gods, he said. And yeah, he called it an existential phenomenon. And he then continues. And then he continues basically that in this case, I mean, talking about COVID, in this case, the disease gods basically are the American elites, and it sounds like the Jewish conspiracy. If you listen to his words here, he called the global financial elite, so could mean Americans to him, could mean Jews to him, but so he blames COVID on America and Jewish people. But he also emphasizes, the benefits of a disease, just how cool it is and how it makes people more, aware in their, just in their existence. And so, yeah, I mean, they were experimenting on themselves. I mean, they were almost killing themselves back in the old days when they drank themselves almost to death or they took drugs. And this is how they sort of got themselves into this feeling of drama and change, because, let's face it, Dugin was never in the middle of the action. He was never a general. He was never leading men into battle. He was never present when Hitler was ruling that empire, or some other dramatic stuff happened. He was always sitting behind a desk, but he wanted this feeling of drama and change. And I think this is one of the reasons they got into this occult stuff and the drugs and the alcohol.
Yeah. Now, turning back to this UFO subject, which what really is interesting is that we had Ross Coulthart's book, In Plain Sight, his interview with David Grush, the U.S. intelligence major who revealed, before Congress and testimony before Congress, that there is a non-human craft that have been a crash recovery program and reverse engineering of crash materials. And of course, just 9 days ago, Coulthart made further revelations and is in touch with numerous U.S. government officials and scientists. And his book is well worth reading because it opens one side of the mystery. We've talked about these occult elements, these very frightening elements. And more recently, Coulthart has been forthcoming about this more bizarre side of the phenomenon. One of the reasons why you would maybe not ever want to talk about it, because you are opening a can of worms. You're opening a door to the muck of the occult, as Freud once called it to Carl Jung. And of course, but if you are the Soviet Union, if you're the communists, you want this Pandora's box to be opened as much as possible, don't you? Because, again, like you were saying, this creation of chaos in the mind, we have in the West these structures based on Christian philosophy, Christian theology, going back to the beginning of Western civilization, out of the fall of the Roman Empire. And these are being torn apart now, so that people are left with this void, you could say, or this chaotic, well, how do we relate to the universe? What is man's place in it? They have no idea. And in pours all this, Madame Blavatsky and Gurdjieff and Crowley and all these ideas. And then you have the UFO thing, which, there's non-human intelligence that's out there to be connected to, and not just non-human, but they're smarter than we are, right?
Yeah.
So you have a kind of, and then you've got phenomenon like Magigora, you've got Fatima, right, in Portugal, and you've got all these questions, and you've got divisions in Christianity, Catholicism, Eastern Orthodox, Protestantism. You've got all of this that can be then, you can actually create psychological weapons here to further destroy Christianity through a divide and conquer game, and the UFO, and the really interesting thing about Nick Redfern's book, which is Flying Saucers from the Kremlin, is that not only do we find this Russian connection to UFO incidents going way back, but we've got people who are kidnapped, they think, by the KGB, who disappeared while looking for UFOs. We've got people like George Adamski, who may have been KGB agents, other contactees, and then the abductee experience, which there's a question, were these people drugged? Where did their experience come from? Are there psychotronic weapons? Is there are there electromagnetic weapons that
Yeah.
can induce the experiences that LSD induces, right?
Yeah, people talk about the loss of sense of time, I believe, with UFO
Yes,
encounters. They
lost time.
they they have all these effects. And it's interesting to me that for me, the American idea was about trusting yourself and trusting other people and trusting certain ideas and just make things happen and just take it step by step, and just create things. And this UFO idea and this alien idea that's attached to it, to me sounds like, well, let's forget about the people. Let's forget about these ideas. Let's forget about the Constitution. Who cares about America? Who cares about any of this old stuff? Here is something new. Here's some new stuff, and this is sort of this is offering more, apparently. So the marketing is as exaggerated as it can be. So this new thing is much better than the old thing. It offers limitless possibilities, free energy, free everything, or whatever. And so why would you stick to this old stuff? If you're not a believer in this UFO alien stuff, then you're backwards and you're old and you're insignificant. And I think this is especially when the communists always tried to make people in the West as disillusioned as possible. So to
Yes,
make people believe that
demoralization.
it can never work, things can never work out for a larger group of people, and so now with this UFO alien thing, it's sort of the same concept. This old stuff can never work out. We can never actually solve our problems without this new thing. We will always fail. We can never make it work. We can never get it right. But here's
Yeah,
this
so
new
we
thing.
need to connect with the monster from the beyond. This is the John A. Keel quote from Why UFOs. Demonology is not just another crackpotology. It is the ancient and scholarly study of the monsters and demons who have seemingly coexisted with man throughout history. Thousands of books have been written on the subject, many of them authored by educated clergymen, scientists, and scholars, and uncounted numbers of well-documented demonic events are readily available to every researcher. The manifestations and occurrences described in this imposing literature are similar, and they're similar to the UFO phenomenon, which is really scary.
Yeah, and I've explained this to the German audience. I've been explaining this for years. How occult Russia truly is today. I mean, there's more occult healers than real doctors, and
Oh,
just
is that
you.
right? In Germany?
No, in Russia. In Russia,
Oh,
there's more.
In Russia. Okay.
There's more. There's been some studies on this, especially there's some studies, some German studies on Russian occultism throughout the decades, and especially about now. And so it's a huge phenomenon in Russia. And so they cannot really. They will give you an official statistic. They will say, vast majority of people in Russia are Christians. Well, they might be listed in the database as members of the Orthodox Church, which is run by the intelligence service over there. But most of these people, they're not necessarily practicing Christians. They're more interested in all this other stuff. So you can buy all kinds of magical healing objects and substances, and you're bathing in moose blood or whatever, just all kinds of stuff that they are offering. And they think that modern medicine is just evil Western stuff. This is not something that they want, because they want the magical stuff. And this is a huge phenomenon in Russia. The numbers of esoteric publications over there, it's staggering, and the amount of books and other papers over there, it's quite mind blowing. I have some notes here, and yeah, I mean, in the 90s, these television, these magical healers like Anatoly Kashpirovsky and Alan Chumak, they were offering these televised, or these seances. So you can actually book a seance over the telephone or the internet, and this became a huge thing in Russia. And from year to year, you had 50% increase from year to year in these esoteric publications. So it's quite amazing how occult Russia had become. And here, this guy.
Yeah, I mean, Russia was kind of the most mystical, most occult oriented country, most country of the great. And of course, you have this Eurasian shamanism. I remember that after the fall of the Soviet Union, hearing about Russian generals linking up with these very, you could say, they were Eurasian shamans. They kind of were probably Uralic people, ethnically. And of course, this is among the most ancient kind of primitive traditions, like almost going to New Guinea and finding a tribe out in the wilderness that had almost no contact with civilization, engaging in some kind of ritual. Witch doctors in the Congo, things of that nature. People being drawn to this, modern people being drawn to this. And of course, if you take away the theology, the tradition, the teachings of the modern religion, or medieval religion, where are you going to go? As this was the foundation of the modern world, really Christianity, what are you doing? What are you opening yourself up for? Especially if there are demonic forces, which is interesting. In the Hermetic literature, you will find references to the idea that the idols of the pagans, and St. Augustine quotes them on this, they were demons that were invited into the idols, and these were given to the people because the common people, weren't worthy of the one true God in the ancient Egyptian religion. They said, "Oh, well, we'll draw demons into the idols. They'll manifest miracles for these simple people. They can't contemplate the one true God." This was kind of the way things were according to this Hermetic literature. But you have, under Christianity, you have the idea of God. All men can reach God. All men can try to be saints. And this produced Western civilization. This produced the kind of virtue and the kind of social discipline and that created the order of the West, which, by the way, is really did prove itself superior to the order in China and India and these other civilizations. We surpassed them with Christianity. Now we want to dump it, right, and just go to something else.
Yeah, I mean, Russia fashions itself as the third iteration of the Roman Empire, and in some ways it seems kind of Roman, where you have all this cult activity going on in Russia. So for a long time in the Roman Empire, you could pick almost any sort of cult. You could just visit this temple today and the other temple the next day. It was all fine and dandy as long as you worshipped the system or the emperor and the Roman. You accepted the Roman leadership, and of course there were these very selective mystery cults where you had to be chosen to be a member and you had to go through the ranks, and so you had from Russia Helena Petrovna Blavatsky, who created the leading brand of theosophy, and so she was always claiming to have all this sort of access to information, and then she was looking westwards. She was founding the Theosophical Society with the American Freemason and Egypt expert George Feld, and she also had the British gentleman called Charles Massey. So it's just always trying to go west, always trying to find people in the West and spread this sort of network over there.
Well, and you had, to reiterate the objective of this, the larger magical project that Crowley, for example, wrote about in his book Magic. I referred to. And it's called. I think the title was "Of Bloody Sacrifice," right,
Hmm.
with reference to materializing entities. And we read, it goes something like this: "The bloody sacrifice, though more dangerous, is more efficacious. And for all purposes, human sacrifice is best." Is that not terrifying?
Yeah.
And if you're truly ambitious in terms of replacing the age of Osiris with the age of Horus, the magical operation of maximum importance is the initiation of the new aeon, like the end of time. You end an age and then you begin a new one. And to do this, it becomes necessary to utter a word, capital W, and that the whole planet must be bathed in blood. And and this is before man is ready to accept the law of Thelema. And so Crowley talks about this great war that has to be fought, this bloody sacrifice, which is, and he calls it the critical point of the world ceremony. And where the Horus is proclaimed and crowned as the conquering child. And this is taken from some kind of Egyptian mythology, but I think that Crowley has kind of remastered it for his own purposes. And chillingly, Crowley wrote that for the highest spiritual working, you must choose a victim which contains the greatest purity. A male child of perfect innocence and high intelligence is the most satisfactory and suitable victim. So, I mean, he's talking ritual human sacrifice,
Yeah.
right,
And
in his book.
yeah, and
Right?
because Blavatsky, for example, Blavatsky was born in the Russian Empire. It seems like the year of her birth was 1831, and she was
And she
baptized.
died in 1880 or 90 something.
Yeah, she
When did she
died.
die?
She died in 1891. And so, I mean, of course, at the time, Europe, I mean, especially, Western Europe is comparatively small, if you compare it to the United States. For example, Germany in its current form, Germany would fit into Texas, I think, 3 times. So this is how small Germany is. And so you could get around in Europe fairly easily, even at that time. So this is why you saw these occultists, going from, Russia to Berlin, Switzerland, Paris, London. So this was it wasn't that far away. These places were not far away from each other. And so, and then of course, Blavatsky's family was aristocratic. Her mother was Helena Hahn von Rottenstern. That was the daughter of Princess Yelena Pavlovna Dolgorukaya. That was that background. And Blavatsky's father was Piotr Hahn von Rottenstern, descendant of the German Hahn aristocratic family, served as a captain in the Russian Royal Horse Artillery and became a colonel at that point.
I believe that family had Swedish blood. I think she was related to Stolypin, the most famous and progressive prime minister of Tsar Nicholas II, who was assassinated, by the way, and who, if he had lived, he may have modernized Russia and saved Russia from the Bolshevik Revolution. So his death was rather tragic. But he was not involved in this magic stuff. This was her thing. I don't recall if he ever commented on it. But I think he was born in 1862, so he was younger than her, and he died in 1911. I think he was assassinated. But so she was from a very influential family.
Yeah, it says here Peter Hahn von Rottenstern, remembered as the father of Helena Blavatsky. a captain of, hang on a second, a captain of
Now,
horse
she
art.
was married to somebody that she never really took up a
Yeah.
life with, right?
So
She just sort of ran away.
well,
Is that right?
Her father Peter Hahn was a captain of horse artillery, uh, known as Peter von Hahn, whose family came originally from the petty nobility of Mecklenburg, that's northern Germany, and so this Hahn family is quite old. Actually, it goes back to the year 1230, and Mecklenburg, of course, the whole nobility of Mecklenburg was overlapping with the Russian aristocracy, the later czars, and all that stuff. And again, old family, always been interested. These old families have always been interested in occultism. The ancient mystery cults, and shouldn't come as a surprise that Helena Blavatsky
But
was.
her book, The Secret Doctrine, it's really quite a piece of fraud, isn't it? I mean,
Yeah,
when
she
you
was sort
read
of a
it, you see
fraud.
that she's taking sort of modern scientific ideas and mixing them up with these occult ideas. And so she's claiming she's channeling these masters, right? But
Yeah.
it's clearly herself sort of just putting together this hodgepodge of contemporary thought, pop thought, into this mixing bowl. And it really is garbage, isn't it?
Yeah, she was sort of a fraud. I mean, but I think that was in the in that phase of especially European occultism that was fairly standard. I mean, because the because technology had advanced, so you could make these intricate little machines to perform sort of magic tricks, these illusions. So when they were doing seances and other rituals, they could fake things, with the help of little machines, and could, make people more attached to whatever they were doing. And so you mentioned Sweden. I think it says here in 1318, King Eric of Denmark granted lands to Johann Hane, and Johann's brother was master of the Teutonic Order in Livonia. And
Livonia was probably part of Sweden. We know that before the Great Northern War. I think Sweden was dominant in that area.
Yeah, and so this basically in a very
Now,
very
now
old.
Blavatsky. I mean, could you classify Blavatsky as a Satanist? I mean, what is this Luciferian stuff she talked about? They talk about Luciferianism. What in the heck do they mean by that?
I'm not so deep into her work per se. I was more looking at the spy background of somebody like Aleister Crowley, but
Is there any evidence that she ever worked as an agent of the
well,
Russian government?
well, not that I've seen so far, but
Yeah.
I'm looking into her more and more because it's always been. I mean, European occultism was always, an environment where spies acted, because especially Blavatsky, she was traveling quite a bit, as did other occultists, and they were visiting all these different places, and they were talking to all kinds of people. So if you get around a lot and you try to talk to important people, that lends itself to espionage, of course. For example, she did these in 1849 she traveled the world, Europe, Americas, and India, and so she got around
Yeah, she did work
quite a
in
bit.
India. She had some kind of institute there in India. Um, it's interesting. And of course, these people don't, I hear people, Christians talk about Crowley or Blavatsky as Satanists, but that's not actually, they didn't regard themselves as Satanists. Satanists like Anton LaVey, who is a self described Satanist, For the record, Crowley said something like, "The devil doesn't exist." So if Crowley doesn't believe in the devil, how can he be a worshiper of Satan, right?
Hmm.
Crowley said that the devil's a false name invented by the Black Brothers to imply a unity in their. He called it a muddle of dispersion. So Crowley was opposed to certain types, even though he was talking about ritual human sacrifice and parts of his book. He would talk against kind of spiritualism. He would talk against this kind of loose black magic that I think we saw in the New Age movement coming out of the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And he said but he did believe in demons, that is, spirits, anti-human spirits. And he said they're always going to be calling for you. And he says, don't fraternize with them. So Crowley said they'll tear you to pieces for their leisure. So it's curious that Crowley, even though he's regarded as a black magician, didn't see him that way. It's just sort of like people don't really necessarily identify with what they are, maybe. And so as occultists go, Crowley was something of a snob. He didn't like necromancers, astrologers, table tappers. He said they make themselves perfectly passive and so far from employing any methods of protection, deliberately invite all and sundry spirits, demons, shells of the dead, all the excrement and filth of earth and hell to squirt their slime all over them. That's what he wrote. He's sounding almost like a Christian pastor, and Crowley warned, "They're contagious as syphilis and more deadly and disgusting, unless your aura is strong enough to inhabit any manifestation of the loathly larvae that have taken up habitation in them, shun them," he wrote. So but the occult is dangerous, is what he was saying, which he would know, right? But there are stories about him using magic to kill people, former associates. And of course, if you play with this stuff, and there's some horrifying stories coming out of Brazil, if there was an American journalist who discovered the realities of this African Brazilian mix of it's not voodoo, they call it something else, that they put curses on people. And he had one put on himself. I forget the author's name, but his experience was rather terrifying. He thought he was going to die. He had to go consult somebody to get him out of it.
Yeah.
So it's not.
And you see the trend of these the trend of these occultists. They travel around and they try to gain access to influential people. I mean, one of the prime example was the infamous Rasputin. The infamous Rasputin. He got close to the czarist, the czarist family in Russia, and this and Blavatsky, for example. Just to not forget Aleister Crowley. I mean, he was meeting with important people. He was around people who were involved in espionage, and they had plots against the United States. And apparently, Crowley was able to gain that intelligence and then relay it back to Britain. So they always try to meet important people. And so Helena Blavatsky, Blavatsky was attaching herself to Henry Steele Olcott. And Mr. Olcott, he was, colonel at some point. Colonel Henry Olcott, he visited Columbia University, was a part of an influential fraternity, became interested then in spiritualism, hypnotism, mesmerism, all that stuff that was around at the time. And he then served in the U.S. Army during the American Civil War. He was admitted as a special commissioner of the War Department in New York, was promoted to the rank of colonel, transferred to the Department of the Navy in Washington, D.C., and following the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, he assisted in the investigation of the assassination. and so on and so forth. So, yeah, influential person who knows other influential persons. So, why would Miss Blavatsky attach herself to that guy? I mean, in some way, Colonel Henry
So he
Olcott,
was an American or he was British?
he was American. Henry Olcott was an
He was
American.
American.
He was also a Freemason, and he was the first president of the Theosophical Society. And so Colonel Olcott was sort of like an early iteration of General Stubblebine, right? I mean, because I never witnessed Stubblebine, engaging in any sort of religious activity, but I didn't see, of course, in everything he was doing. So he wasn't the
He never
first. I mean,
mentioned being a Christian or having any faith or anything.
no, never saw any of that. No church going, no crosses, no nothing. And but there was also not. You also didn't see any talismans, around. You didn't see any, esoteric mumbo jumbo stuff either. But man, who knows? I mean, so there you have this Henry Olcott, very influential guy, and he was an occultist. Became president of the Theosophical Society, and of course, then he contacted other people. He tried to gain all this influence, and so one thing, I guess, then leads to the other. So they created the society and made a name for themselves. It says here he traveled quite a bit himself. He was in India, for example.
They all love to go there.
Yeah, he wanted to receive the translations of sacred Oriental texts, which are becoming available as a result of Western researches. His intent was to avoid the westernized interpretations and to discover the pure message of texts from the Buddhist, Hindu, and Zoroastrian religions. So the old Persian religion, Zoroastrianism. And Olcott's research and translation efforts put him in dialogue with anthropologists and scholars. He corresponded with Max Müller, German Orientalist, lived in Britain most of his life. And he also personally met both Müller and Edward Bernard Tyler at least once at the University of Oxford. So important circles, important people. Everybody's interested in this stuff. So, of course, you have to ask yourself if espionage was, quite a thing in these occult circles.
Crowley, who, is believed to have been involved in espionage, and of course was extremely involved in the occult. You know what he said about these folks, about these Masons, these people that dabbled in this stuff? Like Olcott, he said, honest but harmless. And I think he meant that as an insult, by the way. He said that people that belong to occult societies, most of these run-of-the-mill occult societies, this is a direct quote from Crowley, he said that they happen as a rule to be pompous busybodies who are governed by persons claiming to represent the true ancient fraternity. And he said these secret societies are a common swindle. That's how he regarded them. And of course, today's numerous conspiracy theories who believe in forgeries and who credit contextual errors and who possess very little knowledge of history, they frighten themselves into imagining that Crowley's pompous busybodies are the real malefactors of history. But no, Crowley just says they're clowns who lack any and every true understanding.
It says here this Max Müller guy was from Germany, but then went to Britain, and he became a big expert at Oxford. And this Max Müller guy, he was attached to this Olcott guy, Colonel, who was president of Theosophical Society. And it says here, Mr. Max Müller got in a bit of trouble for his anti-Christian views. He was severely criticized, and so that didn't fly too well. with some people, and yeah, he contributed to the developing interest in Aryan culture, which often set
Whatever that
Indo-European
is.
Aryan traditions in opposition to Semitic religions. And he was supposedly deeply saddened by the fact that these classifications later came to be expressed in racist terms. This was far from his intention, really. Blah blah blah, and yeah. So he did. He was awarded some of the highest orders for his research, especially at Oxford. So yeah, these are the circles they were moving in. So yeah, I mean, obviously, what reason would you have to associate with Helena Blavatsky? I mean, what was her qualification other than this occult stuff? And then she's, working with a highly decorated colonel who has access, who was part of the war ministry and the Navy, and has all this access. So now she's moving in those circles, and so then this guy has access to this Müller guy at Oxford, and on and on and on and on. So yeah,
And how it's very disillusioning for somebody who wants to find the truth, that you see somebody that becomes this household word like Blavatsky, whose theosophy is just a pastiche of plagiarisms and nonsense. I mean, the new age movement, kind of you add witches' spells to tarot cards and the power of positive thinking, and what comes out the other end, it's just the pompous busybodies, that Crowley was talking about. But of course, as Annie Jacobsen shows in her book Phenomenon, the intelligence services of Russia and the United States during the Cold War were looking at these people like Geller, and she writes about an American who was even maybe more powerful than Geller in what he could do, who they suspect was assassinated by the KGB in Las Vegas because the Russians were so afraid of the guy. That there really are people with psychic abilities, that governments can harness them as weapons, and that, as my parapsychologist friend said, well, we don't understand this. We know it works. We've studied it. We know aspects of it. We don't really understand it, right? Because when it comes to philosophy and the true nature of reality, we just don't know. We have theories, how things work. In physics, we've hit the wall in physics, where physics is leading us back to magic, right? Back to the embracing of things that Crowley is talking about. That's pretty crazy when you think about it.
Yeah. So they had, they created a special organization. I mean, not just the Theosophical Society, but also they created a special lodge, and they had a magazine called Lucifer Magazine.
Yeah, there's your Luciferianism connected to Blavatsky.
Yeah.
So what's the connection between the Thule Society in Bavaria and Blavatsky's theosophy? And there's anthroposophy, right, in Germany.
Yeah, that's correct.
So maybe, and this is connected to the Third Reich, just to some of the Nazis. So how does that plug into this? And how does it plug into some of these British groups and this idea of Bulwer Lytton and the secret race, right? There's some kind of connection to some civilization under the earth or interdimensional beings that some of the Nazis believed they wanted to get in touch with, and then there was that coven of witches that Himmler used to contact this planet to build a super weapon, right, under Hitler. Is there any truth to any of that? What are these rumors?
Well, it's difficult to reconstruct because a lot of stuff at the time was not written down. You don't have a ledger with all this activity that was going on. So you do have to rely on people sort of talking about it, some people commenting on it, some documents that survived. So it's quite it's quite a huge task to reconstruct that. And I did get into this quite a bit a few years ago, just accessing my notes here on that. Hang on a sec. Yeah, because there was so much mythology added to it that it became difficult for people to differentiate fact from fiction. So sometimes people believe, well, this character was a member of the Thule Lodge, which he really wasn't, and so there's all sort of this contradictory information about this. But if you look, if you look at this, if you look at the right wing scene in the 1800s, so before the Nazis, so this was a very dangerous time, because the right wing was assembling its ideas from various sources. So, for one, the right wing was copying the Jewish world conspiracy idea of the earlier left, especially the early French socialism. They created the modern anti-Semitism, and the right wing, they just copied from that. So this was one element, and then British occultism. British occultism played a major part of it. This was also something that the right wing in Germany was adopting. So you had these publications, you had the books, and then, for example, Hitler, he was collecting the Osterer magazine. And apparently he had every single issue that was ever produced. But this was just an entry point for him, because for Hitler, this was something of his interest, but anytime he could upgrade, he could gain new access to people and ideas, he would drop the old ideas and he would just abandon the old people he was dealing with. So he was collecting, as far as we can tell, he was collecting the Osterer magazine, and it was full of these crazy ideas of anti-Semitism mixed with occultism, and they concocted a false history of the white race, basically. And it was they were using anything they could get their hands on. So, for example, they had this idea of an old Armanen culture. So this this very old white perfect culture that was then lost. And if you look in history, they said you could find these little clues pointing to this very, very old, forgotten Armanen culture. So you could rediscover it and rediscover its magic. And so that was part of it. And it became very, very psychopathic, very aggressive.
And you got Rosenberg's book, The Myth of the 20th Century. Are you familiar with that at all?
No, not the book, but people like Rosenberg. I mean, Rosenberg, he brought the protocols, or he popularized the protocols of Zion with the Nazis, and Rosenberg was attached to aristocratic circles, aristocratic families, who were also heavily involved.
He was born in the Russian Empire in the Baltic states, so he actually was born in the Russian Empire.
But as we saw some of these old families, like the Hahn family, where Blavatsky came out of, this old Hahn family from Mecklenburg. I mean, you saw aristocratic families from Mecklenburg heavily involved in the Nazi movement and in the earlier right-wing organizations. So in the earlier phase, this is when it was built. And so you had these rich old families that were, well, tied to Britain mostly. The loyalty was to the British Empire, not to Germany. And so this is where these British ideas were, funneled into Germany, into the German right wing. The German right wing didn't invent anything new. They always just recycled ideas and they rehashed ideas. And this is also where this idea comes from that, Germany at some point could have an alliance with with the Brits, with Britain. And so you saw all these organizations appear, and all these organizations that were recruiting members. They were recruiting from the military, they were recruiting from the universities, the business world. And this was around the time when certain families, tied to Britain basically, and certain families, they had to rebrand, because this was getting closer and closer to the First World War. And so there was this marketing problem. Are these families loyal to Germany, or are they loyal to Britain? And so that's when these specific families, when they created right-wing organizations, or they infiltrated right-wing organizations and gave money to them. And so over time, year by year, decade by decade, people sort of believed they were the most right-wing patriotic thing you could imagine. And it was all about, white power, white people magic, and, dominating the world. And even in this Ostara magazine that Hitler was collecting, in this Ostara magazine, you find praise for specific, families of the high nobility, the same families who were funding right-wing groups at that time.
So Hitler's sort of romance with the Brits comes from him reading this stuff.
This was his entry point, and then he moved up the ranks because he got around, he met new people, and every time he was trading up, he was sort of abandoning what he believed in before. So there is, I think, even in his book Mein Kampf, there are negative descriptions of these normal right-wing groups. So he was considering them to be weak, ineffective, especially against ineffective against the communists. He said they were just talking, and they were not warriors, and they were just phony, basically. So I mean, he was getting into this stuff, but then he thought, nah, this isn't good enough. I found something better. And the more people he got to know in his early political career, he was moving up the ranks, not just politically, but also in terms of his occultist leanings. He became more and more an admirer of the old Roman Empire. And he believed that Austria, his home where he grew up, Austria was not a successor to the Roman Empire, that they were doing it wrong. And also on German soil, the Prussians, he didn't believe they were the true successors to the Roman Empire. And he also believed that Britain was not doing it right, especially because of Jewish banking and all that stuff.
And he was going to do it right.
Yeah, he was going to be the best. And also his later buddy, Mussolini, he was also a great fan of the Roman Empire. And Hitler's political career took off in Bavaria. This is where I am right now. I'm right next to Nuremberg, which was one of the main cities for the Nazis. And there's this is basically a big Colosseum in Nuremberg. It's almost an exact copy of an Italian Colosseum or building dedicated to the Emperor Augustus, who was a dictator. This was also an inspiration for Napoleon, by the way. And so they have this building in Nuremberg, then they have this giant field for these big party events. And all the architecture, it's all Roman. And in Bavaria, obviously, you had sort of these old traditions and mystery cults. So, for example, this is where the Roman Empire was bleeding into the southern Germanic sphere. And as far as historians could figure it out, the Roman cult, Roman intelligence and Roman military and Roman culture, that all became quite popular here in the south of Germany, or what is today Germany. And so this is where it all blended. For example, there's an interesting museum here. I think they call it the Germanic Museum. I think they would say it in English. The Germanic Museum. And when you go in there, you see all these terrific exhibits, and it's really a blend between the old Roman stuff and Germanic stuff. It's weird to describe because it's mostly art, but of course there's more behind it. There's more to it because all of this art and architecture, all of these exhibits, they are tied to mystery cults and occultism. So it's not just art, something nice for you to look at or something to look impressive. And so this is where it all met. This is where right here, this is where it all blended. And so it is understandable that Hitler would be getting more into this, into the Roman, culture and tradition and the mystery cults. And it's hard to document. It's really hard to document because the things that we saw, for example, the Thule Lodge, Thule and some of these other organizations attached to it, they were partially it was more like to some degree it was like a Masonic lodge tailored to a Germanic audience, but at the same time they were engaged in covert operations. So for example, when World War I ended, the communists tried to take power. So for example, they tried to control Munich, the city of Munich, and Munich was then liberated from the communists. And so these lodges, these right-wing lodges, they did play a certain role in, just repelling the communists. And some of these Thule members were actually shot and killed by the communists. I think even somebody from a very, very old family, very powerful aristocratic family, was killed. And so it's it was the organizations where we can tell were active, like Thule, they were attached to some other networks engaged in various operations. So it's not like you can point at one of these organizations like Thule and say, this is the center, this is where it all happened. It was more of a network. It was more of a cluster, and quite a bit of it was secret. But you can sort of fill in the blanks. You can sort of figure things out if you understand the larger sphere in Bavaria at the time. And even going back, hundreds of years, who were the influential families, who became then influential in the Nazi Party, and, what were the connections of those families. And so very, very old families, very Roman. And it ties into Italy as well, because after the Western Roman Empire was done, you saw some very influential families in, what's now northern Italy. And some of these families, they remained relevant even until the time of Mussolini and, the King Emmanuel. So rulers that Hitler was working with. So, for example, if Hitler was working with the Italians, in these old families, so you can imagine what Hitler was getting himself into, basically. It's difficult to reconstruct because you don't get the magic box of documents. That one drawer of membership lists and documents and stuff. But you have to piece it together, and it's a really, really large puzzle.
Yeah. Well, there is in all of this, one of the interesting things, getting back to UFOs and the USSR. Jacques Vallée, who is one of the leading researchers in UFOs, he's a computer scientist and astrophysicist, spent decades researching it, and does not believe, by the way, the extraterrestrial hypothesis is proven. He is rather suggests an interdimensional hypothesis in his book Dimensions. But he went to the USSR shortly before the collapse I guess he was invited there to compare notes, and he's got a book on this, which I read some years ago. And the thing that stuck out in the book is what the Russians were most interested in. They really seemed bored with all the usual UFOs aspects. They were interested in really ancient temple sites, holy sites. and why they were located where they were, and that there was something about the Earth's electromagnetic field and the placing of these sites, the siting of these ancient temples. And the Russians were also, so there was, the Russians seemed more focused on lost civilizations, antiquity. And what's interesting is that this brings me to a Soviet born writer, Zachariah Sitchin. You've
Oh,
probably heard
that
of
guy.
him.
Yeah, that guy.
He claimed that he could translate Babylonic cuneiform and Sumerian cuneiform, and he claimed that the Babylonian or Sumerian mythology was about extraterrestrials coming and genetically changing man and so on. And so you've got in this ancient astronaut literature, you've got this idea that extraterrestrials made the human race, that we're
Yeah.
not made by God, which is, and it's funny that that Sitchin comes from I believe he was born in Baku, or he was born in Azerbaijan, I think. And that he comes through Israel. I believe he was Jewish. He comes through Israel. He becomes this self-proclaimed expert and he claims he taught himself how to read the cuneiform. And from what I've read from people who are experts in this field, his translations are wrong.
Yeah.
His claims are not correct. That he is fudging the facts. He's trying to make this propaganda. He's trying to get people to believe in these ancient astronauts, that the first religion of the oldest civilization, the Sumerian civilization, was all about ancient aliens. And so, and this, I think it has a tremendous subversive psychological effect on modern men, because here people are looking for something to believe in. They're losing their older beliefs, and here is this idea that there's these gods that made
Yeah.
us, that these aliens, and that they're coming back, right? The 12th planet, according to him, has this really eccentric orbit. So it takes thousands of years for it to go way out away from the sun and come back close to the Earth, so that it's coming back. And you'll hear this on talk radio. When I'm on talk radio, I hear callers talking about this all the time. And it is mixed up with conspiracy theories about, oh, they're hiding the truth from us. The U.S. government really knows. But the Russians, and I think the reason that the Soviet Union was interested in this is they're interested in creating new mythologies, creating a new religion, maybe for mankind to believe in, a new creation story, right? What do you think of this?
Well, I've looked into these guys a couple of years ago. I just brought up this text from my website. So here I got some notes on Zachariah Sitchin, and it well, first of all, it seems like a soap opera in space, or an intergalactical soap opera. What he's describing.
Yeah, it does, doesn't it?
It sounds like the novel Dune, that was recently that there's a new movie out and there's a sequel coming out now. So it's these different societies, these civilizations fighting each other, and so this is something that's created. It's a soap opera, and experts Michael Heiser and Ronald Fritz, they criticized Sitchin's translations, and it's always it's always these beings that he describes. They are way more advanced than we are, they say. So they could dominate us, or they can help us and save us and whatnot. But at the same time, they are prone to human-like behavior. So they have family drama, they have aristocracies, they have dynasties, and they have warring factions and just battling for getting the crown, basically, and stuff. So it's very reminiscent of these ancient the ancient gods, from the ancient mystery cults and the stories. On the one hand, they were supernatural beings. They had all this power, yet they were plagued by, pretty human attributes. So they would get envious, they would get arrogant, this and that. And so it's basically something that is tailored for an audience which grew up on television. So if you want to get into, if somebody wants to get into real research on these ancient cultures, you can get into research, but it's just, it demands quite a bit of effort on your part. If you want to get into, multiple dimensions, you can read literature on that by actual experts, space travel and all this stuff. So you can get into the science, but most people, they don't have the time, or they don't think it's rewarding enough. They grew up on television, movies and television shows. And so that's why I think Sitchin's stuff became so popular, because it talks to people. It makes them think that these beings, these aliens, are relatable. And so Hollywood really took on this idea. I mean, the first Alien movie by Ridley Scott, then the sequels, especially the sequel called Prometheus. Prometheus, who gives fire and science to humans, and it's this story of, especially in Prometheus, where they explain that these super beings, these so-called engineers, they created humans. So we're somewhat like them, but we're not as, great as them. They created life on Earth, but then they send a ship to Earth to destroy us, and for no apparent reason. So it's in this storyline, the humans, they find their, they find God, basically, or the gods. But then they figure out these gods are not what we thought that they would be. So now we have to rebel against them. We have to defend against them. We have to fight against them.
Which is Gnostic, which is very Gnostic.
Yeah, exactly.
These gods, these creator gods are evil. They're like archons, right?
Yeah.
They want to destroy mankind.
Yeah, and so
torture mankind.
Yeah, and the implication
this theme. Yeah. There's another book, The Gods of Eden. One of my readers gave me it, but I had already had it. I have 2 copies of it. I had read it years ago. William Bramley. And this is extremely paranoid. This book is about secret societies working in tandem with aliens, or alien/angels, interdimensional beings who, they're vampires. They're psychic vampires. That is, this is a torture planet, and you see Alex Jones has the thing, Prison Planet. Well, that's really what this book, The Gods of Eden, is about. Man was put here to be tortured and for the negative emotions to be harvested by the gods of Eden. And this is, it's hardly you could have a more Gnostic and a more, a theme that's hostile to the idea that we live in a good universe with a good God, and everything's going to be okay, sort of Eggbot kind of thing. It paints a pretty scary, malevolent picture of the universe.
Yeah, but of course, if you look at David Icke, David Icke was preaching this stuff, and the implication is, if you get hooked into this, it offers all kinds of possibilities. So if you're poor, if you're ill, if you hate your life, if you hate the world, there's this big, great hope, because these supernatural forces or beings or whatever, they could change everything. And now, obviously, as time went on, David Icke has aged, and his health problems didn't, magically disappear, despite him being a practicing, esoteric or theosophist or his own brand. So it's the same. It's this classic problem. He's preaching this stuff. He's preaching this method. He cannot fix his own problems. But at some point, especially when people in the audience, when they try psychedelic drugs, they just think about, well, maybe, things are not gonna, the special things are not gonna happen during my lifetime. But once I'm dead, then my soul is free and then I can go on to the next stage. Or some people, they wait for a cataclysmic event, or they wait for the aliens to arrive, and it's just this. It's just these mechanisms that are being employed, especially with the psychedelics, because when you're
If
interested,
there is if there's a technological breakthrough, both in terms of mind control drugs and in terms of new propulsion systems for aircraft, you could hypnotize people, you could brainwash them, you could fake an alien contact, you could fake an alien presence, couldn't you?
yeah, yes,
I mean, you could
and of
pull an
course,
operation off.
yeah, and then now it's Elon Musk who is rumored. I mean, according to big newspapers and their sources in influential circles, he's rumored to be experimenting with psychedelics. I mean, he did have he did take cannabis from Joe Rogan on the show once, and he got in trouble for that because his company that makes rockets, SpaceX, they have government contracts, and you can't have a government contract and smoke marijuana. So he had to be drug tested for a while after that Joe Rogan appearance, and so I think he's visiting the Burning Man festival, this occultic, festival thing that's been around for a long time. And he wants to populate space. He wants to create these new civilizations. He wants to have a space station on Mars and then just go into deep space. This is sort of his inspiration and his drive. So, but you can see sort of this asymmetry that's becoming worse, I think, in society. For example, you have Elon Musk, who is a sharp businessman, who's very into engineering, and he recruited all these, world-class engineers to make these rockets and these cars and everything. But on the other hand, the general population finds it harder and harder, or they're, especially with all this communist nonsense around. People are not seeking out the opportunities. They're not seeking the opportunities to get a better education and to move up the ranks. And so part of society is becoming more smart and advanced, and they visit the greatest universities. And the average population, they don't even read books anymore. I mean, even if you have the most baseline job you can imagine, you could still get great books and start reading and become smarter and become tuned to this to what matters. But people don't generally do that. And so what is this alien UFO esoteric stuff? What is it doing to these people? Because the people, they want something. Just like Bird Stubblebine, when he was burned out after Vietnam, they're all craving something. They're craving something new, a new outlook, new opportunities, a new hope. That's what they're craving. And so this is what this movement is sort of pretending to give to people. And this is like the most baseline intelligence technique ever. If you want to recruit people, you have to find out what they want, what they fear, and what they want. Now, with the Cold
That's
War...
why intelligence services like the KGB, now SVR, and the Chinese, they create dossiers on people. They have them psychologically profiled. And for decades, this, what's really frightening is the new technologies that are emerging, like we talked about chemical, mind control weapons. But the Soviet and now the Russian leaders, they've been dropping hints about weapons based on new physical principles and also psychophysical principles, psychophysical weapons that has been referred to in some published Russian literature. And in 2012, Putin actually published an article that he mentioned these weapons. And he said these weapons will be comparable in results to nuclear weapons. But more acceptable politically and militarily. So even Putin has mentioned psychophysical weapons, whatever they are. I mean, this is a very vague term. We don't know what's meant by it. And although we know very little about this class of weapon, the Russians have been working on something called psychotronic generators. and that are designed to brainwash people at a distance. We only know this because it's referred to in different non-classified Russian sources. And so what is a psychotronic weapon? How does it brainwash someone at a distance? And when I'm looking at people being brainwashed all around me. People who 2 years ago were readers of mine, who think I'm the devil now. And I'm shaking my head going, what? They are now pro-Putin and they used to
Mm-hmm.
read me? Don't they know the facts? Putin cannot be a good person. This is not a friend of the United States or the American people. And
And he's just one person. I mean, he can't run everything and make every decision. You're dealing with a larger system.
right. Um, a retired, I think he was a Soviet rocket forces general, but he may have become a general after he was in the rocket force. Major General Vladimir Semenovich Belos. He wrote an essay some years ago, I think he's deceased now, about the, quote, dosed presentation of ideological and psychologically provocative material and the skillful alternation of truth and false information for creating a powerful means of psychological offensive. I think we've both seen that. I think we've seen this in Germany and the US. I believe it's underway. And Major General Belos, it casually in this context, I believe it was a video interview, made a remark about UFOs. And he said, there is no doubt that as the natural sciences develop and fundamental discoveries appear, new weapons will be created on the basis of understanding UFOs. He didn't explain what he meant by that.
Oh boy.
And cryptically said UFOs were a force of nature, like gravity, and he suggested they could be harnessed. And one of my Russian sources reported that during the 1980s, some of the grown children of Soviet strategic rocket forces generals had become involved, as I think I mentioned earlier, in Crowleyism, in the occult. And so Russia, with this history, you mentioned that Russia has this occult history, was the center of Europe's occult interest. I think that this really has continued in Russia under the new name of parapsychology, or these new sciences. And we don't know what this is, but I think when we look at what David Grush's testimony before Congress, there is something real here. We just don't know what it is, and it is very dangerous.
Yeah, it seems. Yeah, I mean, from these descriptions, it sounds like, well, the UFOs, they're everything and they're nothing. So it's deliberately vague because when you employ a psychotronic or psychoelectronic device, it could work if you've pre-prepared the target population with certain ideas.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then there's been some serious work done on chemical weapons in Russia. I've recently read into that, and so they are just very interested in non-lethal stuff, just substances that influences the target population.
Yes.
And so
They've got self-destruct drugs. They have drugs that make you go crazy and want to kill other people.
Yeah.
They found drugs to cause all. In fact, there was a town, I think it was in the far east of Russia, might have been in Siberia. They poisoned the water supply with it, and they had to have a regiment of troops standing by in this experiment. And Joe Douglas had found the report of it. They gave it to the people, and the people started to kill each other in the town after they were given this drug.
Yeah.
They had to send the army in.
Yeah, and there's different things that can be done. I mean, there was a small German cult which recruited members, and they had them in the cult center over certain weekends, and apparently this cult would then give these members drinking water laced with a substance or more substances, and it was low dose. And these people these cult members would then have a terrific, great experience over the weekend. So not only would they feel more attached to each other, they would feel more attached to the leader, to the ideology, and to the universe. And some people described milder hallucinations. So they thought they were somehow seeing angels of some sort. So this was done without people's consent. So they got drinking water. They were told they could not drink any alcohol whatsoever during this entire weekend, probably to avoid, just a cross effect with liquid ecstasy or some other drug. And so this is something that's been done by all sorts of cults throughout the ages. I mean, it's possible that somebody slipped something to Albert Stubblebine. Maybe somebody gave him something, and some people might remember the Frank Olson case when government scientist Frank Olson was given LSD without his consent and his knowledge. They had this.
That's a horrible. By the way, that's a horrible thing to do to somebody.
Yeah, this legend.
It's a crime.
Yeah, I mean, they had this regular meeting in this lodge in the Cold War, where department heads were supposed to attend and talk strategy and talk projects and stuff. And so you had people from the CIA, you had people from the technical service department, people from the military, and so according to testimony and witnesses, they were all given something to drink, and then before the effect kicked in, they were told this drink contained LSD. And so this is what happened. So maybe this is what happened to Bird Stubblebine, and he got an experience it seemed very positive to him. And so if you find the right approach, you give out this information to people, and then you just use chemicals, you use psychotronic weapons to create sort of an effect, and in conjunction with each other, these elements could actually work, the way the Russians wanted to work. So this is something that people should be aware of. I mean, especially during the Cold War. I mean, with the Cold War, people became sort of disillusioned because nobody seemed to have the great, once and for all answer. How do we create world peace? Well, we just produce the Soviets. They ran out of money. Okay, well, good enough, but how is it going to continue? And so it was very disappointing. I mean, what happened after 1991?
Of course, people should not have been disappointed because this is life.
Yeah.
We have all these unsolved problems. They're not going to be solved. You're not getting out of here alive. We're all going to get sick and die. Every one of us. We got to have a solution to the problem. No, you're never going to have a solution. You have to accept this is life. It is for a reason. You have to deal with it. But people, they want some kind of perfect thing. They want heaven on earth. And this is where the communists and the occultists and the people with these fake promises, these swindlers, come into the picture. And the revolution is a swindle, the Marxist revolution. Leninism is a swindle. The everything the Russians and Chinese do is a swindle. And all these promises from these both Democratic and Republican politicians in the United States, and I'm sure the politicians in Germany, it's like, can you believe a word out of their mouths? No, because they know people are hurting. And guess what? Well, suffering is part of life. We have to deal with it. But, we can relieve your... No, you can't.
Oh, there's this book. I remember this one book in my collection. I think it's from the 1990s or the 1980s. This was written about a strange trend in German, but not just German, children's television. So children's shows became increasingly occultist and esoteric, and sometimes it was German production, sometimes it was American programs that American programs that were then dubbed into German, and that sort of thing. And so you had, what was it? So people started to notice a trend. You had the Care Bears, the Care Bears with their
yeah.
love magic. They radiate, and so
They have
many
little
other,
hearts that come off of them in the
yeah,
cartoon.
and so many other shows that had quite an esoteric occultist, not just an undertone. It was more like the core of the whole story. And
Mm-hmm.
it's love magic. You see so many children's stories where, well, they say love conquers everything, but they kind of use love in the story as magic, as a magical force. This was also true for the Harry Potter novels and the Harry Potter movies, because when you're a parent, you have to watch all of the movies multiple times, or you have to read the books multiple times, and it's basically a Masonic story. So J.K. Rowling wanted to she was fascinated by Scottish Masonry, but in the story, love is used as pretty much magic, and this is something that I found very strange and problematic, because when the story progresses and the main character becomes older and older, he becomes more of a leader to fight evil and to fight the bad guys. I always imagined the protagonist would become sort of would become more of a warrior and more of an intelligence person who figures out how the enemy is thinking, and then he conquers the enemy. But no, it's this love magic thing. So it's like they use it as a magical force, and this is how he always wins. And of course, this is not something you could apply to the real world. I mean, you can be loving as much as you want. This is not necessarily how you defeat an enemy, especially when this is the main aspect of your strategy. And so this is
an interesting point to make, and it's a sociological point about middle class society. You have in economics, and you see it in libertarianism, why libertarians are so subject to manipulation by the far left, by the Russians and the communists, is because there is this belief among the libertarians that the world, we can solve all problems through free market economics, that it's a win-win game, and that by working together, this is a kind of form of love, right? If we just put away enmity, if there's no reason why human beings should be enemies, right? You got to get rid of the idea of the enemy. And you have this idea in America, and I think it's in Germany too, that the word enemy is just a wrong word. There is no real enmity. Enmity is something that bad people create.
Mm-hmm.
People who, the military industrial complex wants you to believe in enemies. So this most basic dimension of human existence, the reality of enmity,
is negated,
removed, right? And you're bad if you believe you have enemies. And it's sort of like, well, you're just paranoid. You're just one of those paranoid anti-communists. It's like, no, remember the killing fields? Remember Pol Pot? Remember Mao, the biggest mass murderer in history? No, these are real people. Remember Hitler? Remember Stalin? Remember Putin? Look at what Putin's doing. He's just battering Ukraine into the Stone Age bit by bit. So you say this doesn't exist? This isn't evil? These people aren't enemies?
Yeah. My kid, I mean, my son, when I was reading, when I was reading these Harry Potter novels to my kids, my son kept interrupting and interjecting. He was asking, why is the protagonist always using the weakest spell? This disarmament and spell where and a spell where you it's a spell where you temporarily stop an opponent, but that's just it. You don't injure him, you don't kill him. It's just the most benign spell you could possibly make. And he keeps using that over and over again. And it creates so many plot holes. And obviously, it's a children's story. I understand that, the publishing house and the author, they don't want the protagonist, children protagonists to start killing people. But then, Rowling, she wants to make this grand, dramatic story with super bad guys and good versus evil. And she puts in stuff that's lifted from World War II and other things. So it creates these plot holes. And my son, who is so my son kept interrupting. He was asking, why isn't he killing that total utter bad guy in that moment when it's absolutely convenient? Why is he not doing that? It makes no sense, because that bad character is going to return later and do something really horrible. And this is on and on all over these books. You can just defeat the enemy with your magic love power, and you never have to get your hands dirty, really. It's just something that even my kid was wondering about. That doesn't make sense. That doesn't make any sense whatsoever. So
if it's all about love, you can't take your bad guy seriously, because the bad guy, he's either misunderstood or he's misunderstanding something. So you've just got to sort of deal with him gently until you can bring him around, right?
Yeah, and it's just if you have like these normal parents, right? If these left-leaning regular parents out there, if they read this stuff to their kids, and if one of their kids, especially boys, if they start asking questions, why they don't kill these enemies when there's actual battle? I mean, we're talking battle, right? The enemies, they want to kill the good characters, but the good characters, they're too hesitant. So normal parents, if their son especially interrupts and asks questions, these normal left-leaning parents, they would just, maybe be outraged, or they just berate the child. How can you say something? How can you say something like this? And they would just shut up that kid. So the kid would never ask these questions again. And this is sort of, it's almost like programming. It's almost like you program that into people. And that's why I always, comment on stuff that my kids watch or read, and I talk with them about it, and I just I let them talk freely. If they have a problem with the story, and or they're asking a difficult moral question. I mean, I was surprised, by my 7-year-old at the time or 8-year-old son, when he was asking questions about these moral dilemmas, and I thought, yeah, that's pretty advanced for a kid. But it's legit. If a kid poses that kind of a question, the kid can probably handle the answer. Not the most explicit answer. You don't want to tell him how bad the world is at that point. But still, I mean, you can just take these kids seriously, and the kids will respect you for that. Because if you just berate your kids for smart questions, they will stop asking these questions, and they will just, I don't know, find some ideology to tell them what's good and what's bad.
Yeah, and of course ideology is bad, because what it is it's a reductionist, simplified narrative or principle that you can judge everything by immediately. And that's all you have to know. You just have to have your little ideological formula, and you know everything. And it's always a lie, it's a shortcut, and it's the basis of these totalitarian systems, communism, Nazism, or the self-misunderstandings of republicanism or democratism. If you study political science, you find, democracy is not, you find Aristotle saying, democracy is a very bad form of government. Yeah. It's not good. Look at the history of Athens.
I mean, this is it's like this thing when Christian parents, or some Christian parents, when they get enraged about, let's say the Harry Potter stories, and because it deals with magic, but there's also some messages in there against Gnosticism. For example, when the main antagonist, the main bad guy, he wants to conquer death. He's obsessed with conquering death. And the good characters, they all accept death, and they don't want to do crazy things in the hopes of combating mortality or overcoming mortality. And I think in the first book or the first movie, there's this scene where the bad guy offers the protagonist the chance to join him, to bring back the dead parents of the kid, and just he makes that offer. It's just kind of the devil offering, making that kind of an offer, and the protagonist refuses that offer. So there's also those messages in there, but at the same time, it's just when you read the story to your kids, you find these moments of where you're thinking, why doesn't the old professor, the old wizard, the great mentor, and the smart character who was supposed to run everything, why isn't he more aggressive in his covert operations? Why isn't he more ruthless? Instead, he just lets things progress until they get out of control. And so the story just, I don't know, it just shies away from... It
doesn't make any sense, does it?
The story shies away from these mortal dilemmas and some of the realities of warfare and combat. You can't just wait for things to escalate and then hope that your love magic fixes everything.
What it's really doing is, I think it's been said by some cultural observers, and this goes back to Eric Voegelin, that Western culture has become Gnostic. The Gnosticism, which is basically, as Voegelin understands, and he's going back to experts on the old Gnostic religion, and Gnosticism could be pagan, Christian, or Jewish even. It is an attempt to say that God is the devil and the world is kind of a prison, like Alex Jones's prison planet idea, and that we need to revolt against the evil, bad system, the world. We need, and it's a metaphysical form of revolt. It's revolting, and so magic is a kind of an attempt to escape reality, isn't it? Magical thinking. We do something and the world is transformed into a paradise, like the love bears or whatever, or like the communist revolution. Both Nazism and communism, according to Voegelin, were forms of Gnosticism because they were forms of fundamental metaphysical revolt, believing that they could magically transform. They could bring the 1,000-year Reich, which is just a takeoff on the Christ's 1,000-year reign on earth, or they could bring the communist millennium as well. And the thing is that there is no such thing. It is a swindle. Gnosticism is not, we are here to deal with human existence, not to escapism. Not to believe that we're here, we just arrived, we want to all kill ourselves, like the Albigensian heresy. The Albigensian heresy was purify yourself and commit suicide and leave.
I noticed
that was a religion.
I noticed that because you talked about escapism, I noticed that not just the fans of the Potter movies and the Potter books, and now there's this video games, you could spend literally hundreds of hours in this virtual dream environment world. And so it's just a way to avoid reality as much as possible. And the creators of these worlds, the video games and the movies and the stories, these creators are somehow playing God themselves, and they acknowledge that.
Yes. Especially
J.K. Rowling, because she's fanatical about her story. She's fanatical about her characters, and so she essentially is the god of her own story. She controls everything. She has full and utter control where the story is going, what happens to these characters, if they have a happy ending or not, if somebody dies or survives. She's in control of everything, and she sort of became she sort of became a member of her own cult, so to say, right? She's created this world. And she encourages anybody to become a writer and start creating their own worlds and becoming the master or the god of this fantasy world. And
what's really terrifying when you go to magical thinking, and the descent into magic and the return of magic, and we don't know what these things are. You go back to Parsons and L. Ron Hubbard being disciples of Crowley summoning this homunculus in the desert in New Mexico. There is in one of the books, I think it's called The Edge of Reality, and it's a transcript of discussions between scientists, and it's J. Allen Hynek, the famous American astronomer who was the official scientific advisor to Project Blue Book here in the U.S. in the 50s and 60s, and Vallée, who was his assistant back in those days, talking about UFOs. And at one point in the conversation, Hynek wonders out loud whether occultists or magicians might be behind the UFO phenomenon, right? And he said something like, people in occult societies might have discovered other ways of doing things or manifesting phenomenon. But Vallée offered the following frightening scenario, which I think is familiar to conspiracists, and it's suppose a group had investigated along the lines of rational thinking and finally contacted another form of consciousness. They would have naturally kept it secret, right? They have access to a higher intelligence. They would make it a secret. And because their leaders were worried of the consequences of releasing it on an unprepared world, they wouldn't let anyone know, thus the secrecy. Because the rest of the world is not wise enough to deal with the secret of this contact with this special intelligence, whatever it is. Of course, that intelligence could be manipulating you, right? Talk about demonic entities. If something's smarter than you, it could imitate an angel of light, right? It could know, it could see right through you. This is what gets so dangerous here. And so now maybe these people who contacted this thing are making UFOs in their backyard. And of course, Vallée said this is a wild theory, but it's something that has recurred in the speculative UFO literature. But I think when it comes to the US government and the Russian government and the Chinese government, it's not speculative. We know they have engaged in deception operations. We know they've infiltrated UFO cults. This is what the book Flying Saucers from the Kremlin shows. This is what Vallée's work on alien contact and human deception in his second volume of his theoretical work shows that the French military, the U.S. military, and the Soviet military have faked UFO incidents, even abductions, right? So that raises the question, how much of the whole thing has been faked? How much involves mind control drugs, psychotronic weapons, or an interaction with a natural conscious phenomenon, like Keel says, demonological, or he would call it the intelligent electromagnetic spectrum. How much has this been drawn in and is being used as a weapon?
Yeah, I mean, it does. I mean, the UFO literature on the UFO alien media, it's promising the most. The marketing is so extreme, you cannot top it. There's nothing
feeding the ET phone home phenomenon, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it
from space.
Yeah, I mean, if you compare it to anything else, I mean, anything else seems to pale in comparison, right? I mean, why would you read about history? Why would you try to understand empires? Why would you read about intelligence? Why would you do all these other things? Why would you care if there's this alien thing and this is cooler and more promising than anything else? Anything else becomes boring. And so it's kind of this over-promising that's happening here, because if you look at the old, the old marketing of the communists, we found this new idea, nobody really owns anything, and we'll have, government officials planning and deciding everything. And now you have this alien thing, this UFO thing. I mean, it's so much more grand and, all-encompassing, Yeah.
I
mean,
well, you
people
have
back
Stephen
then...
Greer in the Disclosure Project, which I don't know if you've studied him at all, but he is promising a kind of utopia.
Yeah.
Because they're hiding the technology, they're hiding the free energy, they're hiding the great, and it's very much along the lines of Marxist thinking, and it's very Gnostic. And he actually takes people out in groups to meditate, to summon UFOs to the Love Fest, right?
Yeah, yeah,
And it's like, and you listen to him, and there's people that have paid for this and gone on his. He charges a lot of money apparently, and he makes a good living at this. I think he was an ER doctor at one time, but you see this powerful desire on the part of people to see the solution to man's problems. And they look up, and
yeah,
there's the flying saucer is the delivery vehicle, right? That's going to deliver us. It's the savior of mankind.
yeah,
And this is, Eric Verglin complained in his writings, his philosophical writings, that there's been an unbroken chain of speculations that has plagued mankind since the high Middle Ages, speculations about establishing paradise on earth. And if you hear people talking about that, run from them, because it's
yeah,
the Nazis, the communists, the Anabaptists, whoever, in Germany, these violent revolutionaries, and I mean the Anabaptists of the 16th century, violent revolutionaries and sectaries that talking about alchemy, Gnosticism, the end of times, like Mr. Dugan,
yeah,
anatizing the Gnostic eschaton, and all these different ideological permutations that are really, the people are crazy. They're just objectively crazy. The more you listen to them, the more persuaded you are that they're these madmen that Keel talks about, who are shooting at each other or will be shooting at each other from bell towers. And it's, you might say, we're dealing with the pathos of thinkers who exist in a libidinous, alienated state,
yeah.
right? And they're obsessed. And this magic thing inflames them, right?
I mean, 100 years ago or even earlier, you could promise people a future of, of motorized tractors, for the field work, and having central heating and having running water in the home. This sounded like great to people back then. But nowadays, it's just they go all out on this utopian stuff. It's just free energy. Okay,
Yeah.
free energy means free everything, because if you have free energy and artificial intelligence, then you don't have to work anymore. So you don't have to work at all, and you get all this cool stuff, and you just get it, for nothing.
You
It's
can
almost like,
you can sit in front of the TV and be entertained all day.
yeah, or you're
You
like,
know.
it's almost like the feeling that a small child has that is being cared for, because the parents, they seem supernatural, they can do anything, and the child doesn't have to take care of anything. And so this is sort of the psychological state that this marketing now, this UFO alien marketing, is going for, that you don't have to take care of anything anymore. It's all being taken care of for you. And this is, I
Yeah,
see people, people losing
yeah.
interest in anything else. Any serious topic is of no interest to them.
Yeah, no, they're not. I mean, it's titillating for them, and it's titillation that we have to be aware of. We have to be, people will reproach this analysis with being, oh, it's boring, it's not exciting. I'm going to go watch the other stuff. You're not going to understand anything. You're not going to really understand the danger, that's coming to you, because people are lying to you, and there's a game going on, a great game, and it's being played on so many levels by very sophisticated human organizations like the Chinese Communist Party, the Russian, the Kremlin elite. They have whole scientific institutes devoted to studying you, studying how to manipulate you, studying the beliefs you already hold, to find weaknesses in those beliefs, to exploit those beliefs by feeding you false narratives you will be inclined to accept. And
Yeah.
they do this. They are doing this.
Yeah, and they can not just exploit weaknesses. They can use your own strengths against you. They can use any
Mhm.
sort of attribute against you. This is what I took away from this whole Bird Stubblebine thing, that he always remained a warrior. He was always kind of this warrior, but somehow um, people were able to redirect his warrior spirit at other targets, or wasting his energy, just redirecting him. So they didn't want to. You couldn't turn a warrior, a general like this guy. You cannot turn him into the exact opposite of a warrior, but you can sort of use what you have and play this psychological jujitsu, and then just redirect.
And you could unstring his bow, couldn't you?
Yeah, you could. Yeah, you could
So he
just.
could never shoot an arrow again.
Yeah, because
This is the
as a
thing that,
general,
yeah.
he could have made a fantastic head of the NSA. He could have developed new playbooks to spy on the Russians. He could have had a great career
But
lasting
did
much
he
longer.
have the deeper philosophical approach and social science epistemology to understand, to cut through, to see what the enemy was doing? Didn't he realize that our enemies in Russia, especially, and in China, were developing new intellectual weapons? It was Little Hart who suggested at the end of his book on strategy, The Strategy of the Indirect Approach, that these new psychological weapons, to find a path of least resistance, to turn your flank, could be in your mind. You could turn your flank in your mind. You were talking about UFOs, we're talking about the cult. We're talking about all these belief systems. Is not these conspiracy narratives, for example, a way of turning our flank politically? And
Yeah.
haven't they turned our flank on the right? Aren't they destroying the American conservative movement? I think they've broken it up, and it's divide and conquer, and they're flanking it with this stuff in a metaphorical sense. And I think in Germany, you look at what has been done to Germany. Germany was the laboratory, was the sociological laboratory for experimenting on these new forms of psychological warfare, because the Germans were a conquered people. They were helpless. You could see in Germany, both East and West, how you could do this to people. And I think the Americans and the Soviets both engaged in experiments to neuter the German mind so that Germany could never really be a country that could ever fight a war again. That is, could never be a whole country again.
Yeah. Yeah. All right, we've come this far. It's more than 3.5 hours.
Oh my.
That's been a very interesting
Yeah.
talk, and
Well, it has.
a very interesting talk. And yeah, I mean, I got some more footage of Bird Stubblebine on my hard drives here somewhere. Haven't found all of it because it's it's almost it's like let's say it's from 2008, 2009, so it's been a while. I will find it probably. I have footage of Bird Stubblebine standing at this space, this area in Nuremberg where the Nazis did the big rallies, and he was talking about the war against the Nazis, and then how it turned into this Cold War, and how Germany, or Western Germany, was about to become battleground. And he was talking about stories about his time as a tank commander when he was in an exercise in the fog. He was leading his troops in a circle, and they all made fun of him, and it was he was talking these old stories, and it's fascinating footage. I think he's a fascinating individual, but anybody can fall for something. So this is some sort of what a professional human intelligence person, what such a person must always remember. If somebody got to Bird, it can happen to you. It could, it may be something somebody got into your head already. This you always have to be on your toes. You always have to be aware. If it happened to him, it can happen to you. That's pretty much it.
That's a good way to leave it. All right. Well, thank you, folks, for joining us. Thank you, Alex. And that has been another edition of Friends and Enemies. We'll see you next time.